circumstances beyond their control. For example, in one case, an individual who had been refused citizenship due to an absence from the UK on a given day, in spite of many years of previous residence, even though this is, of course, no fault of his own. The bill provides further flexibility to waive residency requirements to help members of the Windrush generation and others acquire British citizenship more quickly. For example, in one case, an individual had to be refused citizenship due to an absence, again, because, of course, it was not their own fault. But, of course, this will mean that children also unfairly denied status, denied British Overseas Territory citizenship, will be finally able to acquire citizenship as well as their own British citizenship here. And this was one of the anomalies, of course, that came out through the whole Windrush scandal. Our laws, Madam Deputy Speaker, must be clearer and easier to understand. And through the Windrush Lessons Learned review by Wendy Williams, it also said that the immigration and nationality law is complex. And this bill gives the Home Secretary the power to simplify and consolidate immigration law so that we can address many of these citizenship anomalies that have existed for too long, for decades in fact. Madam Deputy Speaker, the British people are generous and compassionate. They give billions of pounds every year in overseas aid to, as I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the Right Honourable Gentleman earlier on, to provide support in countries around the world, to empower countries and communities, to invest in many economies. And also the British public embrace those in genuine need and want to see people succeed. They also want to see a system that is fair and a system that is firm. Fair to the British people, fair to those in genuine need, but firm against the criminals and those who exploit our generosity by gaming the system. And this bill is critical to delivering that new fair but firm system. It is also central to our new plan for immigration. It does address, and it goes a long way to address decades of failure, decades of challenges, both in the law, both on illegal migration, immigration, but also in terms of immigration courts and tribunals in the way in which I have just reflected upon, while at the same time, as the Windrush scandal has shone a spotlight in terms of many of the anomalies that have existed when it comes to citizenship. These are the areas that we will change, with secure borders and rules that will be easy to understand. And this is effectively part of the cumulative end-to-end change that we are seeking to bring in. We want to slam the door on foreign criminals, put organised crime gangs out of business, and of course, give the help and the support to those in genuine need. Everyone who plays by the rules will encounter a new system that is...
Order, I hesitate to interrupt the Home Secretary. Does the Honourable Lady have an actual point of order?
Madam Deputy, as the Home Secretary is very eloquently saying, this is an incredibly important piece of legislation. The lack of opportunity to hold the government to account on this legislation is a source of real concern. Can she invite...
That is not a point of order. We are starting a debate, the purpose of which is to allow this House to hold the government to account. We will be doing so until 10 o'clock tonight and then again tomorrow. That is not a point of order, and the Honourable Lady knows that. Home Secretary.
Speaker, and this is an important bill, and it is right that we have given the House plenty of time to debate this important piece of legislation. But I think it is important, just to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, that while we are seeking to achieve systematic end-to-end reform of this system, it is complex. It is absolutely complicated, and throughout the course of this debate and in committee stage as well, I hope all honourable members will actually reflect on some of the points that have been made on my side of the House effectively, that over decades we have found anomalies in our system. I've mentioned Windrush, I've mentioned tribunals, I've mentioned many of the processes that we want to streamline that will of course deal with efficiency and productivity in terms of case management. But fundamentally, Madam Deputy Speaker, this new system will be a system that is fair to those that need our help and support. And everyone that plays by the rules will encounter a new system that is fair but firm. And as representatives of the British people, we will be finally in control of many of these highly challenging issues that obviously many successive governments have sought to address in different ways. But now this government is committed to fixing the broken system.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. And just before I call the Shadow Home Secretary, I would be obliged if the honourable gentleman doesn't speak loudly while I'm on my feet. He can heckle other people, but he shouldn't be heckling the chair. I will draw to the attention of the House that obviously there's a very large list of people who wish to take part in this important debate, and therefore there will be an initial time limit of 4 minutes, and that will then reduce to 3 minutes at some point later, depending on how fast we proceed. Nick Thomas Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we on these benches will be opposing this bill. It is a bill that is wrong, and it will make the dangerous situation we see in the English Channel worse. Now, we on these benches do not want to see people risking their lives making a sea crossing in some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, often in boats that are unfit for purpose. But the measures proposed will not address this. By judging claims on the type of journey people make, ministers will create a discriminatory two-tiered approach to asylum. Not my words, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the words of the United Nations Refugee Agency. And that must be our starting point today. Any proposals, and I'll come to some in a moment, to address this profoundly serious issue must be compliant with the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. We should, in this House, remember the circumstances in which that convention was created. Drafting began in 1946 after the end of the Second World War, as the full horrors perpetrated in that conflict had been brought out into public view. It was a noble ideal for nations to work together to prevent such awful things happening again. Countries came together to ensure that across the world, we would offer a new protection to those who suffered persecution. Countries would not look the other way when there was systematic persecution in other parts of the world. We all bore a responsibility in our common humanity to help others. The convention was signed under the post-war Labour government in July 1951, but the document became one of the foundation stones upon which all post-war British governments stood, a matter of pride to our country and of the values we stand for around the world. It sent out a clear signal that Britain was a force for good and was setting a strong moral example that gave Britain the authority to argue that other countries take responsibility as well. It is to this government's shame that it stands outside that fine British tradition. 70 years after the 1951 Convention was signed, this government has decided to renege on its commitments. I hear what the Minister for Immigration Compliance says, so don't take my word for it. This is what the United Nations High Commission for Refugees says about these proposals. The International Refugee Protection System, underpinned by the 1951 Convention, has withstood the test of time, and it remains a collective responsibility to uphold and safeguard it. If states like the UK, that receive a comparatively small fraction of the world's asylum seekers and refugees, appear poised to renege on their commitments, the system is weakened globally, and the role and influence of the UK would be severely impacted. UNHCR is concerned that the plan, if implemented as it stands, will undermine the 1951 Convention and international protection system, not just in the UK, but globally. And if the Minister doubts that, this is what the United Nations Refugee Agency had to say ahead of this second reading debate. Plans to create a new lower class of refugee are discriminatory, breach commitments in the Refugee Convention, and should be dropped. They are breaching commitments in the Refugee Convention that a past British government that truly believed in a global Britain had signed. In fact, the UN Refugee Agency said the two-tier approach is, and I quote, a recipe for human suffering, social problems, inefficiency, and greater cost to the taxpayer. Frankly, I will one word. Frankly, it is a dangerous and ill-thought-out proposal with profound consequences. I'll give way.
Honourable Gentleman, given that there seems to be unanimity that this bill should be interpreted in light of the Refugee Convention, and apparently the government intention is to follow the Refugee Convention, surely there could possibly be no objection to an interpretation clause within the bill, then we can all work together to put that in there to ensure that all the provisions follow refugee case law and the Refugee Convention as it is.
The gentleman is absolutely right. And in reality, this is a bill based on an immigration plan that is harmful. Just listen to the story of Wahid Aryan, now an NHS doctor, who escaped the Taliban in Afghanistan as a child. These are his words. When I arrived alone in London, a bewildered 15-year-old with nothing to my name but $100 and my hopes and dreams, I had no idea I'd end up 2 decades later working as an NHS doctor fighting COVID-19 on the front line in A&E. As a former child refugee from Afghanistan, under the UK government's so-called new plan for immigration, it is doubtful I would be here at all. It is doubtful I would be here at all. We also know the serious concerns that have been raised by campaigners across the LGBT plus community about this bill. The way it is so badly drafted risks us turning our back on people fleeing persecution. This is particularly chilling when we know the scale of the dangers faced by so many LGBT plus people across the world, including state-sanctioned persecution. The plan is wrong, and it is wrong-headed. I'll give way.
The Honourable, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If the Honourable Gentleman listens to my Right Honourable Franklin Whitton, we're not on about Wahid. We're not on about stopping Wahid achieve what he wants to do. We're on about people who are coming here through safe routes, often adults, who are using that child route and stopping them from abusing that system. Perhaps if the Honourable Gentleman had actually listened to my Right Honourable Franklin Whitton, he'd have probably picked that up.
With the greatest respect, if the Honourable Gentleman would listen to me, it wasn't my words I was quoting. It was Wahid Arian himself that I was quoting. The government says that the asylum system is broken. I totally agree. And it's the Conservative government that's broken it over the past 11 years. Under this Conservative government, the asylum processing system has imploded. Their own incompetence, removing targets from the system and failing it in a moment and failing to run it properly has completely undermined it. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He says it's imploded under the Conservative government. I would remind him that after his party had been in power for 10 years, there was a nearly 500,000 backlog of asylum cases, and 120,000 of them were put in the controlled archive because they were unable to trace them.
Well, if she wants to hear about statistics, Madam Deputy Speaker, try these. The share of applications that received an initial decision within 6 months from 87% in 2014 to 20% in 2019. That's the scale of the failure of this government. At the end of March 2021, this year, over 66,000 were waiting for an outcome on their initial claim. 75% of them, over 50,000, have been waiting for over 6 months. And new research from the Refugee Council shows that in the most recent data available, over 33,000 people have been waiting for over a year. I've been intervened on about the last Labour government, but that represents a tenfold increase in the past decade. Tenfold. Failure heaped upon failure. And not only that, the initial decision-making is so poorly judged that around 40% of initial decisions are overturned. So 4 in every 10 decisions are wrong. Yes, this process is broken, and frankly, it's getting even worse. I will, of course, give way to them.
I note the Honourable Gentleman has made the point about initial decisions. Does he not recognise that one of the problems has been the ability for people to bring extra evidence after that decision has been made, so that the court is often looking at a case that is different from the one that on which the initial decision was made?
I'll come to that point in a moment because I've got deep concerns about that. I mean, the Right Honourable Lady actually passed, as has already been pointed out, the legislation on modern slavery. But it is also the case that victims often feel too traumatised to talk about their experience at an early stage. So this idea of giving such minimal weight to later evidence I find very concerning, particularly in the modern slavery context. And I'll come back to that in a moment because I know it's a matter of concern on those benches as well as these. On a side,
I do apologise, the Honourable Gentleman, he's very gracious in giving way. But can I just say to him, that comment about modern slavery, and he will hear that I have some concerns about modern slavery aspects of this bill, but that comment on modern slavery did not respond to the intervention that I made.
No, it did not.
Well, with great respect to the Right Honourable Lady, she was making the point about late filing of evidence, and I was making the point in response that the way in which this bill, and I'll come on to it in a moment, I'm quite happy to give way to her again when I do, But the way that this bill is framed in terms of the very little weight that's directed to be given on late evidence is very concerning with respect to victims who are unable to talk about their trauma at an early stage in the proceedings. I will come back to it, and I'm very happy to give way to it again when I do. On asylum accommodation, the idea of sending people to offshore processing sites is dehumanising and it's unconscionable. As the UN Refugee Agency puts it, the UK should abandon plans to externalise its refugee commitments, which would see it shift responsibility for protecting refugees onto states with less capacity and more refugees. And frankly, it's an attempt to distract from government failure on the housing of those seeking asylum. Of course,
I'm very grateful to him for doing that. I agree with him about this point. Of course, Australia has undertaken offshore processing, and there are terrible stories that shame Australia about what's happened to some people in those places. Has he had any indication of where these offshore places might be that asylum applicants could be processed?
My honourable friend's absolutely right to raise that. Unfortunately, I've had no such indication beyond leaks to the media, which fact will probably not surprise my right honourable friend. Last month, the High Court judgment on Napier Barracks found inadequate health and safety conditions and a failure to screen victims of trafficking and other vulnerabilities. The Home Office continued to house people against the advice of Public Health England, endangering those in the accommodation, staff and the local community. It resulted in what the court described as an inevitable COVID outbreak in January 2021, with nearly 200 people testing positive for the virus. No wonder the independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons published an emergency report that raised serious safeguarding concerns. On asylum accommodation, this government has failed and failed dangerously. The idea, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this bill helps those fleeing violence and persecution does not stand up to scrutiny. And let me take one example, because the former Prime Minister raised it a moment or two ago. The bill says that evidence submitted late without good reason should be given only minimal weight by asylum judges. Asylum seekers have been required for the past 19 years to submit arguments and evidence at an early stage. But now it seems we're going to have a situation where judges are directed to give minimal regard for evidence being given late. But there are many reasons why refugees, and particularly victims of human trafficking, cannot provide evidence at an early stage, not least because it is difficult for survivors of trauma to talk about their experience immediately, including, and indeed especially, women and other survivors of sexual violence. And that shows the real failure at the heart of this bill. It fails victims of human trafficking. It is a bill that is a glaring missed opportunity to address the vile crime of people smuggling. Instead, this government will turn their backs on some of the most vulnerable people on earth. The bill changes the law, so that helping an asylum seeker will no longer need to be for gain to attract criminal liability. That's what the bill does. Now, that's a profound and dangerous change in the law. Could potentially criminalise the Royal National Lifeboat Association for saving people at sea, and seems to take no account whatsoever of the international law of the sea that requires ships' captains to assist those who are in distress. And let's be frank about this. Had this been in place when Sir Nicholas Winton was rescuing hundreds of children from the Holocaust on the Kinder transport, he would have risked being criminalised. And it's no point members shaking their heads, because what this legislation does is it risks bringing into the scope of the criminal law those who are helping people for humanitarian reasons. It is, well, he says it's disgusting. That's what's in the bill, Madam Deputy Speaker. I suggest he takes it up with the Home Secretary. It is wrong, it benefits nobody, and it sends out the worst possible signal about this government's intentions. So let me turn now to what the government should be doing instead. First, we need legally binding targets for clearing asylum cases and proper resourcing for Border Force. This government is, this government is failing, and it is not acting in the national interest. The system is hugely costly for the taxpayer, And it leaves people in the asylum system stuck in limbo, neither able to properly enter society and rebuild their lives or be returned to a safe country. There is little wonder the performance has been so poor due to the cuts to border force. I'll give way.
Honourable member for giving way. And this might be me being naive and quite new to the House, but isn't the whole purpose of a second reading to actually then go forward to a committee stage where the opposition can put forward their points, rather than voting against the whole bill, which would stop this broken system that they keep mentioning in this chamber?
The bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, is wrong and it will not solve the problem. Let me just continue with the critique. The government, no, I've given way to the lady. The government should seek to rebuild the system so it is fair. Quick, effective decision-making is in the best interest of everyone. And what ministers should be doing is legislating for legally binding targets for processing asylum cases. We need a proper plan to deliver deals with international partners to tackle gangs, because the measures completely fail in their own terms. Because the measures outlined in the government's plans are all dependent on deals with international partners, both to stop criminal gangs operating on the French coast and to replace the Dublin III regulation, allowing those registered in a safe country before they reach the UK to be returned after a failed claim. The existing arrangements with France on stopping gangs exploiting people and putting them into boats in the English Channel clearly aren't working. Now, the Minister for Immigration Compliance talked about his joint operational plan. He said it would be completely cutting this route, and he would be working at pace, I quote, in the coming days to make that a reality. That was 11 months ago. The government talks about safe countries, but ministers have not signed one of the required deals with any of the European Union countries to return those whose claims have failed. The government has shown a complete inability to deliver these deals, which also risks leaving people stranded in the UK, unable to be returned and in limbo. And yes, there should be full life tariff sentences for human traffickers and tougher sentences on modern slavery. The problem is that under these plans, the government will weaken protections for victims of modern slavery. And they will do, well, I suggest the Honourable Gentleman reads clause 48 of the bill, because he will discover in it a higher bar for people receiving support as victims of human trafficking. And that is despite the fact that recent reports show 4 out of 5 rejected trafficking claims are overturned on appeal. These reforms risk leaving greater numbers of victims without support and more gangmasters free to commit further crimes. Human trafficking and modern slavery are vile crimes. Those responsible should face the harshest penalty. Yes, a full-term life sentence for those convicted for human trafficking and increased sentences for perpetrators of modern slavery, but that is not effective if you are withdrawing support from victims. And I come, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the issue of safe routes for claiming asylum and helping unaccompanied children. Following the outbreak of the Syrian civil war and the resulting refugee crisis, the government agreed to the Lord Alf Dubs Amendment to accept unaccompanied children to the UK. The initial pledge was understood to have committed to provide support to around 3,000 unaccompanied children, but the scheme closed, having been capped at 480. It was wrong to close the Dubs scheme after helping just a fraction of the number of children promised help. And it has meant, I'm afraid, that the UK under this government has looked the other way when unaccompanied children have faced dire consequences, including when the Moria refugee, in a moment I will happily do that, including when the Moria refugee camp was ablaze last summer. Worse still, clause 9 of the bill introduces a new requirement for the registration of a stateless child, aged 5 to 17 as a British citizen or a British Overseas Territory citizen, and maintains existing requirements in relation to those aged 18 to 22. No wonder that there is concern about this and the concern about leaving children stateless and running contrary to the UK's obligations under the 1961 UN Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. I'll give way.
Well, the Shadow Home Secretary talks about the Dubs Amendment, those 480 children. Can I remind the House, those children were already in safe European countries. Can I also remind the Shadow Home Secretary that the United Kingdom has more unaccompanied asylum-seeking children currently, over 5,000, than any other country in Europe, including Greece and including Italy. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the point of providing protection to those in need in war zones, the resettlement schemes that have been operating here since 2015 have seen in excess of 25,000 people being directly resettled, not from Europe, which is safe, but directly from war zones like Syria. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is more than any other country in Europe. This government's record is a proud one, and we stand by it.
Well, we'll see how proud the record is in a moment as we go through this, Madam Deputy Speaker. But let me just say to the Shadow Minister for Immigration Compliance, that, Minister for Immigration Compliance, I'll certainly stand corrected on that. The point is this, that they were local authorities that were willing to step up and help further beyond that 480, and it was this government's absolute failure, including mine, absolute failure. Yes, and I'm very proud. Absolute, utter nonsense. I visited the Syrian refugees in Torvine, so I hope that the Minister will take that comment back because it's utter nonsense. Now, the government often talks about the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme. I just heard it from the Minister. Now, of course, I pay tribute to local government, including my own local authority of Torvine, for stepping up to help deliver safe havens for those fleeing persecution. Those who have come to the country under that scheme have added to the diversity and richness of our communities. But the government has gone quiet on a 2019 commitment to resettle 5,000 further refugees at the conclusion of that Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, and still refused to make proper commitments on the future of the scheme. Now, existing safe routes are very limited. The Minister stood up to speak about the statistics. Well, in March 2021, the new UK resettlement scheme began. In its first month, it resettled a grand total of 25 refugees. The lack of safe and legal routes will lead to people continuing to attempt dangerous routes to the UK. Now, the Home Secretary shakes her head. But the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, in a 2019 report, responding to irregular migration, a diplomatic route, warned exactly of this. A policy that focuses exclusively on closing borders will drive migrants to take more dangerous routes and push them into the hands of criminal groups. And the Home Secretary should remember it. She was a member of the committee and her name is actually attached to the report. And Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst we are here debating, or at least should be debating, a plan for refugees, we should cast our minds back to last week and the failure to restore the 0.7% commitment to international aid. The Department for International Development was the government department tasked with delivering help to countries to tackle poverty, to tackle the drivers of why people became displaced from their homes in the first place. Abolishing that department was wrong and it was short-sighted. The work that was going on around the world to tackle the refugee crisis had been starved of funds, with programs suddenly cut off and our reputation around the world as a force for good being damaged. The government should restore the Department for International Development and restore spending to 0.7%. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is as wrong as it is ineffective. It will not tackle people smugglers and it will not protect victims of human trafficking. It is in reality a continuation of this government's culture war. It's a culture war that led them to side with those booing the England men's football team for taking the knee. Instead of supporting that brave stance against racism, the players were dismissed as taking part in gesture politics by the Home Secretary and was told to stay out of politics altogether by other Conservative MPs. Last week, they refused to live up to their promises on international aid and ran away from their own failure to stand with football players against racism. This week, they promote more division with this bill. As ever, they talk tough, but deliver nothing. As it stands, this bill is a charter for human trafficking. It's a missed opportunity that represents the worst of all worlds, letting evil criminals off the hook and failing those who have been exploited. The cruel irony of this government's approach is they're weak on taking action against criminal gangs and brutal when it comes to orphan children from war zones. I ask all members of this House to reject this bill in the vote tomorrow.
Thank you. The original question was that the bill be now read a second time, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the ordered paper. The question is, that the amendment be made, and I reiterate that I'm sorry, we have to start with a time limit of 4 minutes, and that is simply because so many people wish to participate in this debate. Mrs. Theresa May. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll try and get as many points about this bill as I can in those 4 minutes. And can I thank the Home Secretary for prior discussions with me on this bill and the government's approach. The government is right to try to find a better way to differentiate between economic migrants and refugees. This is an international challenge. I said this to the United Nations in 2016 when I said we actually need to revise the international conventions on this issue so that we can more clearly focus our help on those who are refugees. We saw this issue in 2015 with the significant movement of people into the European continent and through many of them trying to get through to the UK. They were widely portrayed as all being refugees. In fact, the majority of them were economic migrants. We need to be able to find a way to differentiate between them.
So you agree with me that the most compassionate thing that we can do to help these people is to stop them getting in the boat in the first place?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and that is why the work that's being done that I will refer to later to increase the economic development of countries that they're coming from, to deal with the criminal gangs is so important. Now, the 3 principles I set out, which I'm pleased to say I think underpin this bill, are first that we must help ensure refugees claim asylum in the first safe country they reach, because the current trend where refugees reach a safe country but then press on with their journey can only benefit criminal gangs and expose refugees to grave danger. Of course, the Refugee Convention does not say that refugees have to claim asylum in the first safe country they come to. We were able to exercise that rule as part of the Dublin regulations, as part of the European Union. Obviously, that's not applicable to us now, and actually the EU has changed the Dublin regulations since. The second point we need is to improve the ways we distinguish between refugees fleeing persecution and economic migrants. That helps us, as I've said, target support for those refugees who need it most. And it actually will help to encourage people to support that if they see that people who are coming are genuinely those who are refugees. And third, we need a better approach to managing economic migration, which recognises that all countries do have the right to control their borders, and we must all commit to accepting the return of our own nationals when they have no right to remain elsewhere. Now, sadly, as the Home Secretary referred to, the business of people trafficking has increased in recent years. To these criminal gangs, it doesn't matter whether they're dealing in drugs or weapons or desperate people. It's all the same, they want to make money. So breaking their business model is absolutely essential. That does mean stopping the routes available to them, but it also means catching them and prosecuting them. But that requires international cooperation. We've been very strong on international cooperation. We need to encourage more countries around the world to see this as an issue that they should be working with us and others on. Now, I recognise that the focus on the bill is on differentiating between those who came here legally and illegally, and I understand why the government has gone down that route, but that in itself doesn't address the issue of better differentiating between refugees and economic migrants. And I would hope that the government can give some thought to how they can work internationally to try to deal with that. There is this concept that Britain could process asylum claims outside the UK. This was an issue that came up when I was Home Secretary. There was a lot of discussion in the European Union. We didn't go down that route for practical concerns. It wouldn't automatically remove the business model of the criminal gangs because they'd be getting people to the centre and they'd be waiting for those who were being rejected by the centre, and they would still move those people on across the Mediterranean. And so there's a potential increase of people being picked up and taken into slavery. And there's also the problem of what you do with those people who are rejected for asylum but who cannot be returned to their country of origin. And also the concept of allowing asylum to be granted outside the UK is a major step. And it has ramifications, for example, for any Royal Navy or Border Force vessel that's operating humanitarian missions in the Mediterranean. I wanted to raise the issue of people seeking protection but entering illegally without a valid entry clearance becoming a new criminal offence. We must not send the message that somebody who is genuinely fleeing from persecution and whose only route out of that persecution is to the UK is automatically going to be seen as a criminal. And the other points, and I echo the comments made by Right Honourable Friend, the member for Chingford and would agree that
Chair, agree with me that part of the other concerns is to ensure that the modern slavery provisions do not end up being drawn too tightly.
I'm very, in fact, grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her intervention, because in fact, I'm just about to come on to this particular point. We are sickened, I'm sure, across this House to know that there are those who are abusing our world-leading modern slavery legislation in trafficking people into this country. We need to deal with the problem, but I have two concerns with the legislation as it is proposed. The first is about timing. This issue that the Secretary of State can require information to be provided within a specified period. It is the case that many victims of modern slavery, it takes some time actually to identify as a victim of modern slavery, let alone then to be able to come together and put the evidence forward to establish that. So I would like some reassurance about how that power would be exercised. I also would like an explanation about the change from needing reasonable grounds that a person may be a victim of modern slavery to reasonable grounds that a person is a victim of modern slavery. I know we need to toughen up to make sure the law isn't being abused, but I think this again relates to the degree of information that an individual may be able to provide at an early stage in consideration of their case. Now, I understand the complexity of the issues which the government's dealing with in this area of policy. There always seems to be a need for a new immigration bill because people are always trying to find loopholes and that they can use in order to get here. But what we must do is have legislation that not only strengthens the government's ability to deal with illegal immigration, but also continues to show that the UK is a country that welcomes those who are genuinely fleeing from persecution. Stuart MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm afraid I regard this bill as a dreadful bill, and I think the Refugee Council was absolutely right to characterise it as the anti-refugee bill. There are 8 welcome clauses in this bill on nationality, but thereafter what we see risks trampling international convention after international convention. And vulnerable children, stateless children, the victims of trafficking will all pay a penalty. But nowhere is a retreat from international law and international cooperation and basic human decency more apparent than the absolute trashing of the Refugee Convention as it approaches its 70th birthday. A convention that has saved and protected countless millions of people being undermined by one of its first champion countries. Refugees and asylum seekers who have skirted over this so far will be criminalised, will be stripped of their rights and offshored. And that is true whether or not they are Uyghurs fleeing atrocities in China, or Syrians fleeing war crimes, or persecuted Christians seeking refuge here. This bill does absolutely nothing to stop them getting in boats in France. What it does is punish them when they get there, and I think that is morally reprehensible. It's not just the awful ends of this bill that justify us refusing it a second reading and stopping it in its tracks, but it's a means by which it seeks to pursue those ends. What we're talking about here is a unilateral rewriting or reinterpretation of our obligations under international law. And that is once more a hugely dangerous precedent to set. And again, we'll make our international partners query whether this is a country that gives 2 hoots about international law and keeping its word. And secondly, to put it directly, what we have here is a deliberate policy decision to inflict harm on people seeking sanctuary, criminalising them, splitting people from their families, forcing them into destitution, putting them in legal limbo, offshoring them. So not just ineffective and dangerous, but morally outrageous. But not only is this bill the opposite of the right solution, it wrongly identifies the problem that needs solving. The problem in the asylum system is simply down to the incompetent management of it by this Home Office and this government. Madam Speaker, we live in a world where around 80 million people have been forcibly displaced. 30 million or so are outside their countries of origin and therefore refugees. 4 million are asylum seekers pursuing recognition as refugees. 86% of them are hosted in developing countries, 73% in neighbouring countries. What we're asking of wealthy Western countries barely scratches the surface of a share of responsibility. And in European terms, what has been asked of the UK is very little at all. Now, I absolutely applaud and I support everything that has been achieved through the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme and other resettlement programmes, but none of it justifies what the government is proposing today. Now, the government regularly trots out that it has resettled more than other European countries of the Syrian refugees, and in absolute terms that is absolutely true. But per head of population, neighbours such as Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, the Swiss, the Finns and the Irish all resettled more. And yes, while the UK resettled a few thousand more Syrians in Germany and France, those two countries offered sanctuary to more Syrians through their asylum systems by massive margins. In 2019, the UK received around 5 applications for asylum per 10,000 people, compared to the European average of 14, putting the UK 17th in the table of member states, just behind Italy, Finland and Ireland. Similarly, the UK granted roughly 2 applications per 10,000 people, compared to the European average of 13, putting it 16th in the table. So yes, while by international standards the UK has a decent history of offering protection, let's not pretend it has been bearing an unbearable burden that entitles it to rip up the Refugee Convention and start trying to pass refugees back up the chain to those who already do much more. The real problem, as we've heard, is that the Home Office's handling of asylum cases is absolutely abysmal. We've heard about all the figures in relation to how long it is taking, absolutely extraordinary figures. And it's not just, of course, the length of time it takes to make a decision, but the number of decisions that it gets wrong. We're at record levels of successful appeals. It's almost 50-50. And it's not just statistics that cause grave concern, but the regular stories of life inside the Home Office, of impossible targets, of a culture of fear or ill treatment of staff, of high staff turnover and a shortage of skilled asylum caseworkers, and of administrative chaos. Asylum decision-making is a matter of life and death, and it seems clear to me that it should no longer be entrusted to the Home Office, a department which has again shown itself unfit for that purpose. It should be removed from political interference and entrusted to an independent body, as it is in Canada, and that would be a sensible approach. Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't, absolutely, democratic oversight as it is in Canada. But Madam Deputy Speaker, members of this House from all parties, and both front benches and back benches, regularly speak up for some of the most oppressed people on this planet. We have seen really brave interventions in the position of the Uyghurs fleeing atrocities in China. The plight of Syrians fleeing a decade-long conflict has been championed, and Christians around the world, including Christian converts, have numerous ambassadors in this chamber. But we've hardly come to terms with what this bill means for them. This bill prompts a question: why speak up against the persecution abroad? Only then, when they come knocking at our door seeking shelter, to say, you're not our responsibility, go somewhere else. France, as it seems to be the popular answer over there. What if France says the same thing in the whole of Europe? We end up with this whole system of international protection of refugees absolutely breaking down, as UNHCR point out. And if this bill passes, that is exactly what this means. Prior to this bill passing, we'd have sheltered these people if they fled here fleeing persecution. But this bill expressly seeks to discourage them from coming here by making life miserable for those who do. Today, if a Uyghur, a Syrian or persecuted Christian convert arrived in the UK to seek asylum, life would be far from plain sailing, precisely because of those outrageous waiting times and the dreadful asylum accommodation, the prohibition on work and the dreadful levels of financial support. But they would get there, and thanks to our amazing NGOs and charities, they would slowly start to rebuild their lives. But next year, if this bill were passed, for many of those Uyghurs, Syrians or persecuted Christian converts claiming asylum here, things will be infinitely bleaker, and that will be a deliberate policy choice of this Parliament. Arriving next year, the Uyghur, the Syrian or the persecuted Christian would be much more likely to be criminalised, and would be so criminalised regardless of arguments about whether they come here directly or not. Just now, Section 24 of the Immigration Act punishes illegal entry by those without leave to enter, but sensibly those who claim asylum on arrival are granted immigration bail, which does not count officially as entry. But Clause 37 changes all that. It would essentially criminalise the very act of arriving to claim asylum, because, as the explanatory notes acknowledge, the majority of asylum seekers will not have the ability to secure entry clearance. Despite her protestations last week, as the former Home Secretary has just said, this criminal offence will apply to Uyghurs or Syrian or persecuted Christian converts or anybody else, and the penalty is up to 4 years in prison. The next problem for the Uyghur or Syrian or the persecuted Christian convert is that although they are absolutely obviously in need of international protection, this government, in its wisdom, isn't even going to consider their claim for protection for 6 months. Now, the government is trying to pretend this is some sort of replication of the Dublin regulations that the UK was party to prior to Brexit. But of course it isn't, because as we've heard, there are no returns agreements with any remotely relevant country, and there is little indication at this stage that there will be any time soon. Any such return agreement would have to be carefully circumscribed so as to be consistent with the Convention and carefully consider the circumstances of the individual, including any ties to the UK, such as family members here. In contrast, the powers in this bill allow the Home Secretary to remove a Uyghur, a persecuted Christian or a Syrian to any country at all, even if there is no connection and with very little by the way of restrictions. Today, the Uyghur, the Syrian or the persecuted Christian face outrageous delays in asylum protection systems. Instead, this bill simply adds another 6 months. And where will they be during this time, during this limbo, while the Home Office goes through the futile motions of seeking to remove them? Just now, for those who seek asylum, we have a struggling, privatised, over-concentrated system of dispersed asylum accommodation. Numerous committees have told the Home Office how it could be improved, only to be ignored. But under this bill and this plan, that is not where the Home Secretary envisages the Syrian, the Uyghur or the Christian persecuted Christian going. Instead, the grim future for these refugees appears under this bill and this plan to be disgraceful, disreputable, open prison-like conditions that we have already witnessed at Napier and Penally, or even worse, as we've heard, they may face being removed to an offshore centre to have their claim resolved. And here is the real asylum shopping, the British government grubbing around to find a country to palm off its responsibilities onto. Think of the outrages and the lack of accountability that we have seen in relation to immigration detention and the Napier open prison. The abuses that have been meted out there and the harm done. And as we know from the Australian experiment, that will be as nothing compared to the hell that likely awaits from an offshore asylum facility. How on earth have we gone from a parliament where there was widespread support for time limiting and restricting use of detention to imposing a form of it that is infinitely worse? Having endured the limbo period, Madam Deputy Speaker, these three groups of refugees will finally have their case assessed by the Home Office. But instead of working to improve asylum decision making, instead this bill seeks to make it harder for them to prove their case. It seeks to alter the long-established test set out in the Refugee Convention that the standard of proof required is a lower, but far from negligible standard of real risk. And that's a standard that is clearly justified by the possible consequences of getting it wrong and the huge challenges of proving circumstances that happened thousands of miles away in a country that the person has fled. This bill seeks to muddy the waters by applying a higher legal threshold. The claimant now has to prove in the balance of probabilities that they do belong to one of the protected convention groups and that they fear persecution based on that characteristic. That not only undermines the cautious approach in the Convention, justified by the dangers that exist for asylum seekers, but pays no regard to just how difficult it is to prove events that happened in faraway countries. And by having two different standards of evidence in the same proceedings, it makes life harder for already struggling caseworkers. The judge or the decision maker may be certain that the proselytising Christian convert will face a death penalty or torture on return. But now the real possibility is that the claimant is such a proselytising Christian convert is not sufficient. If the judge is only 49% satisfied that the person is such a Christian convert, the claim is going to be rejected, even though the risk of torture or death is absolutely certain if the decision maker has got that assessment wrong. Madam Deputy Speaker, I find that deeply troubling and it is clearly inconsistent with the Refugee Convention. But let's imagine the persecuted Christian, the Syrian and the Uyghur have survived the limbo period and they have made it through the asylum system and the Home Office refusal of their application has been overturned on appeal. Unbelievably, the harms inflicted on them by this bill have barely started. On the contrary, the repugnant programme of disincentives is ramped up further even after they navigate that system. Because they've stopped temporarily in a European country, they're to be treated as a second-class refugee. And regardless of what any minister says, that is absolutely contrary to the Refugee Convention. And more importantly, it's just simply disgraceful, not just nasty, but sickening. Very briefly.
I thank my noble friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that on many occasions, particularly for those seeking asylum on the basis of their sexuality, that those in the LGBT plus community are the most likely to be adversely impacted by this new legislation? And does he agree that more should be done to protect them and ensure that they can come here as a safe haven?
Well, Fed makes a good point, and there are all sorts of problems with provisions in this bill which penalise late disclosure of information, which can very often be the case in terms of modern slavery or LGBT cases or even religious conversion cases. So having established that they are refugees, and the government has had to recognise that, the system should allow them to rebuild their lives after the trauma of their persecution, their journeys and their asylum claim, but instead, this government still wants to turn the screw. Instead of the stability and permanent resident refugees were once provided with, today they're given 5 years leave with a review that's fairly light touch before settlement. But this bill and the government's plan propose endless 30-month cycles of review and ongoing attempts to remove. Nobody can rebuild their lives in those circumstances. And I don't know how on earth the Home Office is going to cope with having to revisit every single asylum case every 30 months. These refugees will not be entitled to public funds unless they are destitute. So say the Christian convert finds some part-time low-paid work, a big ask given language and cultural barriers and enforced years out of work and the trauma, but there will be no universal credit to cover housing or income shortfalls. And if he or she was able to bring a child, there will be no support for that child. And the refugee family reunion rights will be diminished according to the plan, meaning they can't be joined by a spouse or a child perhaps. The detail is not in this bill, but that is what the plan suggests and the bill enables. And that inevitably gives them a choice. Does the family stay apart, or do other family members, the women and the children that the Home Secretary professes to be protecting, then have to follow and to make their own dangerous journeys? Madam Deputy Speaker, without the family, without state support, without stability, there is no hope for the Uyghur or the Syrian or the persecuted Christian convert for rebuilding their lives. That does not amount to a place of sanctuary. It is a place of punishment. and the Home Office has the audacity to claim that this is in their best interest. This is, in short, an outrageous way to treat refugees, and that is why it is rightly been called the anti-refugee bill. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's so much that could be said about the undermining of efforts to support trafficking victims, the total absence of protections in this bill for children, the undermining of rights of stateless children. We need to know what the placeholder clauses will give rise to. We don't even have the chance to debate them here during second reading, and there are 6 or 7 of them. And the whole of dentistry, the dentistry profession, is up in arms at the suggestion that the discredited and unethical dental x-rays could return as an inaccurate method of assessing age. Well, that's what the dentistry profession says, and that's what the UNHCR say. It's not accurate, and it is entirely unethical. She is making it harder to identify victims of modern slavery and cutting their recovery period to the minimum allowed in international law. And there is so much that should be in the bill that is not, and I mentioned just one thing. The failure to end the disgracefully painful 10-year route to settlement that many essentially British kids face, and the outrageous fees that others are charged for registering their entitlement to British citizenship. When will that finally be done? Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an abysmal and indeed a shameful bill. It does not remotely deserve a second reading.
Thank you. We now go by video link to Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I draw the House's attention to my registering the members' financial interests for the support that I have received for research capacity in my office in relation to my work on asylum seekers, refugees and migrants from RAM, the Refugee, Asylum and Migration Policy Project. There is a real problem when discussing immigration, asylum and our borders around language and indeed tone. I tried for 18 months to try to get that tone right. I will admit not always successfully, although if I listened to the Shadow Home Secretary this afternoon, there was much apparently I did not do successfully. But I always remembered that behind every visa application, every asylum claim, every journey to the shores of the UK, there is a personal story, an individual. And meeting people in detention centres, Syrian refugees who came here fleeing war, meeting young people trying to regularise their status to complete their education, was both the toughest and the most rewarding part of the job. I welcome my Right Honourable friend, the Home Secretary's reiterated commitments to a firm but fair immigration system. And there can be no question that the issue of small boats making perilous crossings of the busiest shipping lane in the world is a challenging one. I have many constituents who are concerned at the crossings, and my Right Honourable friend in her opening remarks reminded us all that this is a trade in human misery. She is right in her determination to crack down on that evil trade, but we need to find practical and sustainable ways to do so. She will know as well as I do that once a craft is taken to the waters of the English Channel, it is not only difficult to stop, but it potentially puts lives at risk, not only of asylum seekers, but of our border force personnel. Small boat crossings are not a problem that is going to be solved on the water, and my Right Honourable friend highlighted the use of guns and of violence. That, of course, could be turned on our own border force mid-channel, and I worry for their safety if attempts are made to turn boats around on the water. I wanted to focus on the issue of support to those seeking to use safe and legal routes to claim asylum here. Britain does have a very proud history of providing a safe haven for those fleeing persecution. I particularly draw attention to the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, as highlighted earlier by my Right Honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead. She has already spoken on it today, but it deliberately selected the most vulnerable, the most in need, and the Home Secretary is right to look at making its successor programme less geographically specific. But we do have an important responsibility to make sure that we resettle adequate numbers, and that will be challenging to meet. We have to be fair to those seeking asylum and fair to the taxpayer. I was pleased to hear the Minister for the Borders say in a Westminster Hall debate recently that there is to be a dramatic uplift in those employed by the Home Office processing asylum claims. That is good news, particularly given the scale of the current backlog. But it's essential for the system to be relatively rapid, and I worry about building in a 6-month delay at the start of the process for those who might have travelled through a safe third country. There currently is no mechanism to return them, and it will be extremely challenging in finding appropriate accommodation for those individuals. Of course, there is discussion of reception centres, but the proposals to establish that are not yet clear. We don't know if that will involve the resettling or the housing in those communities of women and of children. and I would gently direct ministers to their responsibility under the 1989 Children's Act. It's absolutely crucial that when we do this, we get it right and we treat people humanely. It is very obvious that local authorities such as Kent, Croydon and Glasgow are already under extreme stretch, and I'm worried that the new plan for immigration might place further burdens upon them. These are long-standing problems, and therefore it is sustainable solutions that are needed. I know being pragmatic is not necessarily everyone's cup of tea, but it's essential.
Thank you. Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and grateful to be following the honourable member who I know has worked hard on this issue. I think there should be widespread agreement that the UK should do its bit to support those fleeing persecution and torture, that the system should be fair and not be undermined, that there should be a crackdown on the criminal gangs who exploit people's misery and desperation, and that we should also prevent the dangerous journeys across the Channel in unsafe boats where lives are put at risk. And that includes encouraging people to claim asylum much earlier. And we have debated in this House many different ways to tackle those problems in a calm and common sense way that avoids stoking up division or promoting hostility against those who are most vulnerable, because we know where that leads. And that is one of the things that troubles me about this debate today and about the approach that ministers have been taking. I also think the bill is counterproductive. It's likely to trap more people into the UK asylum seeker system and drive more people into the arms of criminal gangs. The caseload, the backlog that we have seen is not a reflection of an increase in applications. In fact, those have stayed at around 30,000 a year, with a drop most recently during the pandemic. But there's been a 27% drop in the number of initial decisions made since 2015 to before the pandemic. And the bill makes that worse because there is no serious return agreement to replace the Dublin Agreement for people who have been travelled through a third country. But under the bill's provisions, asylum seekers who've travelled through third countries will have to wait in the system for 6 months, and those whose claims are unfounded won't be assessed or be returned. Those whose claims are justified, who need support, won't be able to get on with their lives or start working and rebuilding their lives here. And more instead will be waiting here, dependent on the support of the Home Office, dependent on making the system more costly for the taxpayer as well. Rightly, the government says we should prevent dangerous routes, but the government has cut the alternative safe legal routes. The resettlement scheme has been halted with no commitment for how many people will be supported. Well, I will give way to the honourable member if he wants to tell me how many places will be included in the resettlement scheme when it restarts.
Well, it never stops. The resettlement, when we met the 20,000 commitment in February this year, the UK resettlement scheme continued. Obviously, making a precise numerical commitment is difficult, given the coronavirus circumstances, but it was never stopped. It is continuing to this day.
I think everybody understands the pressures from the coronavirus crisis, but what we need is a commitment to the number of places. The UK has been resettling around 5,000 a year over the last few years as a result of cross-party consensus to support Syrian refugees. But we haven't yet heard a commitment. Will it be 5,000? Will it be 10,000? What will the support be from the government to ensure that resettlement scheme continues? The DUB scheme has been cancelled, even though we know the need for support for those who are most vulnerable, and the Dublin family reunion system has not been replaced. And Safe Passage, who work with young people in need of family reunion, said that last year, under the Dublin scheme, all the young people that they worked with on family reunion went through the legal system. They didn't try to go with people traffickers or with people smugglers to try a dangerous route. This year, however, under the new system, they said that a quarter of those children and young people that they had been working with instead had given up in frustration and sought to try illegal routes and ended up in the arms of people smugglers or people traffickers as a result. And those are the dangers that we face if there aren't the safe legal routes for family reunion, we end up with more people being driven into the arms of these dangerous criminal gangs. But clause 26, the offshore processing, is perhaps the most troubling of all. The government's floated a range of impossible proposals, sending asylum seekers to be processed on the Ascension Island, on the disused oil platforms, and most recently to be sent to Rwanda. Of course, these proposals are impossible, but it's deeply troubling that the minister even thinks it's okay for these to be floated and not to deny them. We heard from Australia about how their offshore processing simply did not work in the end. They stopped sending people there in 2014 because there were too many humanitarian and practical problems, and it was costing them around $1 billion Australian a year to accommodate just 350 people. This is not an answer, and it is also deeply shameful and undermines our international reputation. We need countries to work together. We need France, we need Spain, we need Italy, we need Greece, we need countries across the world to work together, but we need for that to show proper international leadership and not to undermine our reputation.
Sir Robert Sims.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When this country voted to take back control, clearly it had immigration in mind. And as we all know, as many of us deal with a lot of casework, this is an extremely complex and difficult area. Over the years, I've always felt that the Home Office has never gone on top of the correspondence, and that sometimes these things go on for years and years and years. So if at the end of this bill we have a more efficient system for dealing with cases more quickly, I think that would be welcomed by us all. When we took back control, it seemed to me it was about us determining our priorities as a country, which may mean that in times of high unemployment, turning the tap off, and in times of high growth, turning the tap on. And it looks to me at the moment like we are probably going to have a labour shortage and may well need skills in certain areas to come in to keep a fast recovering British economy going. But my constituents do get very upset when they watch television. They see the reports of people arriving on boats, something like 8,000, because they feel, can't the government do more? And we all know the problems of trying to deal with small boats in the water, in the channel. And we've tried to cooperate with the French, who I understand are doing their best to try and stop the trade. But where you have a situation where people are arriving on a daily basis illegally, and then when we finally put them on the plane to go back to the country from whence they arrived, human rights lawyers get involved, then clearly we have a system that isn't functional and is going to drive some of our constituents nuts. So I think it's insofar as this bill gives us a vehicle for starting to try and deal with this, I think it could be welcomed. Whether the whole balance is right, I don't know, but I think that as it goes through its committee stage, there'll be opportunities to improve. And I think breaking up the criminal gangs and trying to stop this trade, which is dangerous and profitable to some, I think is a vital thing for the government to try and do. The Honourable Member for Romsey is absolutely right, though, that there are countries, that most of the people who are economic migrants do come through 2, 3 or 4 safe countries, and maybe leaving France is such a terrible place that the government, the tax rates, the sunshine we have in the United Kingdom and the English language is a great draw. But the reality is we do, as a responsible neighbour to some of the EU states, have to take some of the refugees that the Italians and the Greeks and the Spanish get because of their proximity to North Africa and the Middle East. And it would be better perhaps to do that in a planned and organised way than to allow illegal crossings of the channel. So this is a complex area. I welcome the fact the government introduced this bill. One of the first bills I did an all-night committee on was in 1998, which was the immigration bill introduced by the Blair government. And this really is a little bit like putting fingers in the dam to try and stop changes as they occur over a period of time. It's a constant battle, and it's a constant battle which both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have always wrestled with. And as we've signed up to various human rights legislation, it's become even more complex. So I welcome this bill. I welcome the opportunity to try and deal with this very important issue. I think my constituents will want to see the end of the rubber boats turning up in Sussex and Kent. And I think perhaps a more streamlined, more efficient system for dealing with these very important and very complex problems. Nobody, I think, in the world has all the answers, but I'm sure that this government is trying its best to get to where it wants to be, which is a fair system, which is equitable.
Thank you. We now go by video link to Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This bill on such an important issue to my constituents and to the country is sadly both a flawed piece of legislation and will undermine our humanitarian obligations and fosters a punitive environment for asylum seekers and refugees, some of the world's most vulnerable people. Moreover, as we've heard from the Home Secretary in opening the debate, perpetuating the myth that the UK is overwhelmed by asylum seekers and refugees to fit the government's political agenda, strong on populist rhetoric and headline-catching gimmicks, but weak on delivery. The reality and the facts tell a very different story. In total, the UK receives a much lower number of asylum applications than other comparable countries in Europe. In 2020, the UK received 29,456 asylum applications, whereas France received over 95,000 claims. This bill is being brought forward because the government has broken our asylum and refugee system through chronic underfunding and mismanagement over the 11 years that they've been in charge. It's a fact that in March 21, there were over 66,000 people waiting for an initial decision from the Home Office, the highest number in over a decade. And it's also a fact that the number of people waiting for over a year has increased tenfold since 2010, from 3,588 to 33,016 in 2020. Unfortunately, the proposals in this bill will just increase the delays and the backlog. Turning to clause 37, which proposes to judge an asylum seeker's claim based on the journey they have made, this breaches Article 31 of the Refugee Convention and will make journeys even more dangerous and will push refugees further into the control of trafficking gangs. And as a member of the Home Affairs Select Committee, I am particularly worried about the lack of safe and legal routes for immigration, particularly in the case of family reunion. For example, let's look at the widely acclaimed DUB scheme. It's helped just 480 unaccompanied children when the expectation was that it could help up to 3,000. The government has claimed that local authorities will not take more children, and I doubt that. In Hull, we have always stepped up. We're a city of sanctuary, proud of welcoming some of the world's most vulnerable people. We've played our part in the Gateway programme since 2006 and the Syrian refugee resettlement programme. However, our pride in this is matched by concern that other local authorities are not doing their fair share. Hull has seen massive cuts to its budget throughout the years of austerity, far more than Tory councils that take no or very few asylum seekers and refugees. The distribution of asylum seekers must be fairer and manageable. The current system means that this Conservative government, often at very short notice with no consultation, can unilaterally increase numbers in a council area with little regard to local resources, the suitability of accommodation or the pressures of the pandemic. So while some councils are simply allowed to opt out, it is wrong and unfair that those councils who engage in a spirit of civic responsibility get treated so shabbily by ministers. Finally, I want to turn to the issue of trafficking, particularly concerned about criminals who traffic women for prostitution. Evidence obtained by the APPG on prostitution revealed that the UK sex trade is dominated by serious organised crime, exploiting predominantly non-UK national women, trafficking them around networks of so-called pop-up brothels and hotel rooms to be raped time and time again. Evidence suggests Romanian women are heavily represented in brothels across Britain. The suffering inflicted on the minds and bodies of these women can scarcely be imagined. Perpetrators face low risk for high profits, and this bill will not bust the business model as the Home Secretary claims, nor will it support the women who have been trafficked. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak in broad support of this bill. It offers a comprehensive reform of an asylum system which is broken and dysfunctional in part. It's clear what's needed, a system which is fair to those in genuine need, but firmly against those who break the rules and to the criminal gangs who seek to exploit some of the world's most vulnerable and desperate people. Access to the UK's asylum system should be based on need, not the ability to pay for people smugglers. And all too often it's them who gain, not the individuals who are being trafficked.
My constituents have been rightly enraged by the images of abandoned boats on the south coast, and they've not been backwards in their demands for change. They don't want to pull up the drawbridge, but they expect that we should have a system which cares for those in need and which exercises genuine control over who enters the country and under what circumstance. Mine's a community of strong ties, which has welcomed families from afar with open arms, but it's also a community which has been frankly shocked that it would appear that we don't have control over who enters and leaves our country. So I applaud my right honourable friend's determination to improve the UK's position. Imagine for a moment the lived experience of some of the people arriving on the UK's shores by boat, a boat not fit for purpose, overpacked with families with a bursting need to leave their homes. People who sold most of what they owned to pay for a journey that is likely illegal from beginning to end, and who have paid what money they've gathered to criminals who care not a jot for their safety or whether they make their end destination. These are people who are drip-fed stories of a land of milk and honey on these shores by gangs who want to extort as much money as possible from them, by making the journey longer, by encouraging them to travel through safe countries to the UK. The gangs don't care about their charges, they care about their wallets. So this is a system which must be reformed, and the most valuable tool to do it is to bear down on those who enable it, the vile criminal gangs at its heart. So I welcome my right honourable friend's determination in this aspect of the bill in particular, but I'd also welcome the government giving some consideration on strengthening an area linked to this, which is about joining up the powers they might employ to gather information from across different silos, from law enforcement, the private sector, the public sector. We know that these gangs are linked to lots of different types of criminal activity, whether it's money laundering, human slavery, common scams even. So we need to break down those silos to work more effectively and tackle them. I also welcome that the government's been clear that we stand by our moral and legal obligations to help innocent people fleeing cruelty from around the world. This is rightly the cornerstone of our immigration policy. Continuing resettlement of genuine refugees, family reunion, and improving the reception processing system, these are welcome measures. I'd also argue that there's another side to this, though, which needs watching. If we choose not to reform the system now, we risk stoking up outrage and fear on our own shores. I've already seen in my own constituency some of the effects of this. We've had hateful right-wing propaganda distributed on the streets, using some of the imagery from the South Coast. Our cenotaph in Barrow was recently defaced, and we've had a very few isolated incidents, thankfully, of racism on our streets. The people responsible are the exception and the fringe. We've got to be in no doubt that by tackling this issue fairly, we remove some of the tinder that could light a dangerous fire at home. Aware of time, I'll draw to a close, and I'll just say that I broadly welcome the measures in this bill. It's beyond time to reform our broken asylum system and replace it with one that is fair and offers a hand up for those in genuine need and targets those who seek to exploit some of the most vulnerable in the world.
Thank you. Now we go by video link to Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me start by saying I categorically reject this bill and its proposals. The UK has a long and proud history of welcoming those fleeing war and persecution and providing sanctuary to some of the most vulnerable people in the world. The Borders Bill would end this forever. This bill would not just turn away people seeking safety in the UK, but it would also treat them as criminals. The most damning assessment of the bill has come from the UN Refugee Agency itself. The UNHCR warned the government's proposals could cause great suffering and undermine the 1951 Refugee Convention and international protection system. The government is fond of talking about the broken asylum system, but fails to acknowledge that it is them who have broken it with a decade of mismanagement. Delays in the asylum system have reached disgraceful levels. Refugee Council recently reported the number of asylum seekers waiting more than a year for an initial decision had increased tenfold since the Conservatives came to power. Then, even with when the decision is made, the number overturned on appeal has consistently risen over the past decade. This bill does nothing to tackle this. Instead, it will increase delays, add to the backlog of asylum claims, and does nothing to address the cultures of disbelief in the Home Office. The government is also keen to emphasize its commitment to safe and legal routes for vulnerable adults and children to reach sanctuary in the UK. However, there are no such commitments in this bill. We urgently need a renewed effort on refugees' resettlement and family reunion. As detention action have neatly summarized, while the bill fails to deal with the real problems that exist in the system, it pretends that the problems lies elsewhere and proposes a host of regressive, authoritarian, and discriminatory policies that will cause deep harm to our society, while abdicating responsibility to provide sanctuary to the world's most vulnerable. The government is simultaneously cutting international aid. This will inevitably drive up refugees' numbers. These two actions combined will have a devastating impact on vulnerable people and refugees around the world. I want to finish, Madam Speaker, by reminding the government that this legislation was an opportunity to overhaul our asylum system and to embed fairness and compassion in the Home Office. Instead, they have chosen to pursue a deeply hostile and unpleasant attack on those fleeing conflict and persecution, who have sought a safe home in our country. I, for one, will never be able to support this, and I hope colleagues across the House will stand against this dangerous and malicious legislation. Thank you.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The United Kingdom has always been a generous, open and welcoming country. We help some of the most vulnerable people in the world to settle and make their lives here. We welcome migrants, refugees and asylum seekers from around the world, and we will continue to do so. Nothing in this bill will change this. People who enter the country legally will continue to be able to claim asylum here. We will continue to prioritise helping the most vulnerable, the elderly, children, the poorest, those who are unable to travel hundreds of miles or to pay people smugglers, like the 25,000 people who have come here through our resettlement programme in the last 6 years. We have resettled more people through this programme than any other country in Europe. People in genuine need deserve an asylum system that functions properly, supports them through the process and makes a decision quickly. Perpetuating the current system is not fair to them. Neither do we want to continue with a system that is being exploited by people smugglers, who callously treat human beings as if they are cargo, and sometimes not even as well as that. This bill will introduce life sentences for those found guilty of people smuggling. It will give Border Force additional powers to search, seize and divert vessels carrying people illegally, and it will provide an incentive to use safe and legal routes to claim asylum in the UK. This combination of measures will disrupt and undermine the business model of people smugglers. Finally, it's important that we are able to keep all our citizens, our constituents safe. There are currently 10,000 foreign national offenders outside of prison in this country who we need to deport. Some of them are guilty of the most hideous crimes. They have no right to be here. Time after time, the party opposite has come here to Parliament to plead for their rights. I am more interested in the rights of their victims. That's why I support the measures in this bill that will end repeated, last-minute and vexatious legal challenges to their deportation, expand the early removal scheme to remove foreign offenders from the UK as early as possible, and increase the sentence for breaching a deportation order from 6 months to 5 years. This bill will deliver an asylum system that continues to prioritise the most vulnerable, immediate indefinite leave to remain for refugees who are resettled through safe and legal routes, tougher sentences for people smugglers, tougher sentences for foreign national offenders who try to come back to our country when they have no right to do so. That's what I'm voting for tonight. My question to members opposite is, will they?
We now go by video link. to Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the opportunity to speak in this debate. History is going to judge our Parliament and our government harshly by this piece of legislation. At a time when there's unprecedented numbers of refugees around the world, the total figure globally is around 80 million. They're fleeing from war, they're fleeing from poverty, they're fleeing from injustice, they're fleeing from human rights abuses, they're fleeing from environmental disasters. And they're living in refugee camps in enormous numbers. In Bangladesh, where there's 1 million Rohingya people, to camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and other countries across the Middle East, including Libya. Those conditions are created by unfair trade, by arms that we sell that bring about the wars, that bring about the refugee flows, and the numbers of refugees are likely to rise. At a time when country after country is closing its borders to refugees, and they're stuck for decades in refugee camps, our government is joining in the throng that is standing up against refugees rather than for refugees. I would have thought that at this time, instead of patting ourselves on the back for our historic good work since 2015, for which the then Prime Minister David Cameron described me as preferring to spend a weekend hanging around with a bunch of migrants. What I found were poor and desperate people who'd walked all across Europe in order to try and get to a place of safety. They were frightened of gangs in the camps, they were frightened of the police, they were frightened of fascist gangs, and they wanted to get to this country where they hoped they'd be better treated. Under this piece of legislation, the government will make anyone getting into Britain their job tiers of asylum seekers, those that come through a moderately legitimate route of arriving at a port of entry and applying, or those that come out of desperation on leaking dinghies. So what are we doing? Are we looking after the refugees or accusing them of wrongdoing by trying to get to a place of safety and then condemning those that try to save them, so that seafarers around the world that pluck refugees from the sea will be accused of illegally abetting migration to this country? It is a terrible situation. 10 days ago, a Royal National Lifeboat, institutional lifeboat, took a group of people on a dinghy into a North Kent harbour to give them a place of safety. Is the government going to prosecute the RNLI for saving life at sea, contrary to the law of the sea, which requires them to save such life? And so I would also ask the government to look at the conditions in which refugees have to survive in this country. The disgusting conditions that were outlined at Napier Barracks, or the number of refugees that are sleeping on our streets and begging to try and survive. And just think for a moment of what it is like to be a refugee trying to make your contribution to our world and being criminalized in the process. We rely on refugees ultimately in hospitals as doctors, as engineers, as teachers, as technicians, and so many other jobs within our society. Can't we, instead of criminalizing people who try to get to a place of safety, have a more humane approach and use this opportunity to legislation to send out a message of decency and humanity and responsibility towards the world as a whole?
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for Islington North, although ironically it is precisely his views on issues such as those included within the scope of this bill which are the main reason why I find myself in this House today. Since 1994, every single year the UK has seen positive net migration. And from 2004, when several new states became members of the EU, net migration has only dropped below 200,000 once. The trend is continually up, and the most recent figures show that 700,000 migrants arrived in the UK in the year ending March 2020. To put that into perspective, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is 5 times the size of Blackpool. This is simply unsustainable. For the last 50 years, the Conservative Manifesto has always referenced controlling immigration. It puts pressure on our schools, NHS and housing, whilst also challenging our identity and values when it is not properly controlled and when new arrivals do not integrate within their new communities. The British people can see this and understand this and have demanded action for at least the last 2 decades. The vote to leave the EU was, among other things, a vote to take back control of our borders and to control immigration. Of course, that is not to say that immigration doesn't bring benefits to the UK, but the oversupply of low-skilled labour has had severe consequences, suppressing wages and reducing the number of entry-level jobs available. I'm so pleased we have a Home Secretary who is willing to discuss these issues and face up to the problems large-scale immigration is causing. Successive governments have been far too reluctant to do so, perhaps through fear of facing the cancel culture of the woke brigade. The element most emotive, and that which angers my constituents more than any other, is illegal immigration, and specifically the thousands of small boats arriving on the south coast. It is high time this bill was brought forward to tackle the scourge of illegal immigration, and I strongly welcome the measures outlined within it. Giving our border force additional powers to turn around boats crossing the Channel, making it a criminal offence to knowingly arrive in the UK without permission, and introducing life sentences for people smugglers will all reduce the number of migrants making the unnecessary and illegal crossing in small boats. However, some will still make the perilous journey. The task of processing asylum claims must be made quicker, and for those which are rejected, we must be far more robust in deporting them from the UK. Over the last 15 years, around 3/4 of applicants that were refused asylum have lodged an appeal. They're vexatious and often last-minute appeals submitted and encouraged by left-wing human rights lawyers. This is at tremendous cost to the UK taxpayer, and it is encouraging that this bill will overhaul the legal system for asylum claims, finally putting an end to this utter nonsense. If people have no right to be here, they should be swiftly deported. It is as simple as that. Those on the benches opposite, including the Leader of the Opposition, have previously stood on election promises to reintroduce the free movement of people, showing just how out of touch they are with traditional Labour voters. On this side of the House, however, we are building a system that is fair for the British people, that reforms our broken asylum system, and this is one I wholeheartedly support.
Thank you. Before I call the Honourable Lady, I should tell the House that after the Right Honourable Gentleman for Chingford and Woodford Green, the time limit will reduce to 3 minutes, with 4 minutes. Anna McMorran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This bill is not about improving legislation. This bill is about hate. It's little more than political gesturing of the worst kind. But it's worse than that. It is pandering to far-right politics, stirring up resentment, fear and division because the system isn't working for them. But this really is the nastiest, most vicious of politics. And we live in an increasingly hostile world. Conflict, climate change, COVID are making life so impossible for many. Innocent families and children fleeing for their lives, driven from their homes and their communities, joining the 30 million refugees worldwide, with little more than the clothes on their back and their hopes and dreams. They flee to protect themselves and their loved ones, but this tragically is a hope that is never usually fulfilled. I recently spoke to a mother who fled drought in South Sudan. She lost her children to thirst and starvation. And I felt the pain of victims of conflict, the many who have fled Syria, who suffered immeasurable brutality and war crimes at the hands of the Assad regime, hearts broken that they can't return. And I've spoken to women and girls forced into arranged marriages as young children after fleeing a life of violence and abuse, faced sexual assaults, gang rapes, exploitation on the road between camps, homelessness, before finding refuge. And to those who make that perilous journey. This government says, we don't care, and is attempting to build a wall around our shores, using a deliberately and unnecessarily hostile attitude, doesn't tackle the drivers of displacement, which will continue to force the vulnerable to flee, which will aggravate the very threats which make our own lives here at home less secure, and make the United Kingdom even more isolated, not just from our own partners, but the values which made us a welcoming nation so many look towards us with hope for. And as this pandemic has shown, our planet is shared, and so too are our successes and our failures. We mustn't forget that the United Kingdom was a co-signatory and the first to ratify, with support of the whole House, the 1951 Refugee Convention for a reason. But rather than be open and inclusive, this government's bill seeks to remove us from those shared challenges, wash our hands of the crises and injustices fueled by many decisions made at home, and weaken communities' resilience overseas. And it seeks to criminalise refugees. They're not criminals, and seeking safe haven is not a crime. The true crimes are the provisions and the intention at the heart of this heartless bill, putting the UK at odds with decades of agreed consensus on the need to offer safety to the persecuted and stateless. And it would break international law to pick on the poor, to pick on the desperate, and the children put in boats by their parents, so desperate because they see that the sea is safer than the land. And when you strip away the means to safe passage, when you cut international aid, which helps people remain in place, and when you penalise anyone facilitating arrivals, how does the Home Secretary intend for desperate people to arrive? In stark terms, what would it have meant for kinder transport? Would it have turned their backs on the children arriving and fleeing the brutality of Tigray and Yemen today?
Sir Duncan-Smith.
Deputy Speaker, I draw attention to the House to my declaration in the members' interest. My focus today, in the short time available, God, I can't wait for this list to end, but anyway, in the short time available, I want to draw attention to a very specific element in the bill, which is Part 4. As my honourable friend will know, I co-sponsored a bill with Lord McCall on modern slavery and modern-day slavery victim support bill, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the Secretary of State, for actually meeting with myself and Lord McCall on a number of occasions, looking for a way to improve the bill before it was published. And I spoke on the 19th of October last year about the need for immigration provision that provides confirmed victims, I stress, with certainty of recovery and the ability to focus on working with the criminal justice system to ensure we increase the very low number of prosecutions for offences related to modern slavery. I want the House to hold that thought because this is really critical. Self-interest for us means being better on this area of the bill. So Part 4 of the bill sets out a number of reforms to modern slavery, and I am aware that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is, of course, seeking to meet varying objectives through the bill. I know she wants to reduce abuse of the system. So I want to deal with Clause 52 of Part 4 first. And that is to say that Part 52 will provide identified potential victims in England and Wales with assistance and support. This is support for the period where a person is in the NRM. Whilst I welcome support for adult victims in England and Wales during the period being put on a statutory basis, as is already the case in Northern Ireland, Scotland, etc., the support that Clause 52 places on a statutory basis is actually less than the currently provided as a matter of practice in England and Wales, which is a problem. And that means that essentially, whilst the current guidance in England and Wales affords 45 days support, as does the statute in Scotland and Northern Ireland, Clause 52 proposes a reduction in support in England and Wales to just 30 days for those who are confirmed victims of modern-day slavery. And I draw that attention to my honourable friend because I think this needs to be dealt with. I would be
grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. My right honourable friend has many faults and a handful of that I'm aware of, but one of them is not naivety. He has far more qualities, and his quality will tell him that the system is being gamed by all kinds of unscrupulous people, and the risk is that modern-day slavery is one of the ways it's being gamed.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I simply say to him, notice what I said. confirmed already status under modern day slavery. And this is important because it means that they've already gone through to the NRM. It's the question of how you deal with them at that point and give them time to arrive at the right conclusions. The provision of statutory support during the national referral mechanism, but then no such support afterwards, makes no sense, as they go out of the NRM and suddenly they're into the cold world, unable to navigate their way, and fearful, by the way, of retribution from those who actually treated them so badly in the first place. And I believe generally the provision of support to help these people is also in our self-interest, because in our national interest to ensure victims get sufficient support to allow them to help police and prosecutors with criminal investigation. So in a way, by reducing this, we're making it worse and by not giving support. And I want to come, therefore, to clause 53. It brings me, therefore, to this point: leave to remain for victims of slavery or human trafficking. This is at the heart of the bill, and I've co-sponsored with Lord McCall earlier on, and we would provide leave to remain for 12 months, along with assistance and support for those adult victims who wanted to remain in the UK. I've given evidence to the Home Office about this, and I'm therefore disappointed that instead of addressing the problems with discretionary leave, which I highlighted last October, the government has simply placed current practice, which is clearly not working, into a statutory framework. And under clause 53, leave to remain will remain as at present discretionary, just as the same justifications for its provision will apply, assisting police with investigations being necessary because of a personal circumstance or that necessary to make a compensation claim. Madam Deputy Speaker, the ability of a victim to remain in the UK is unchanged by the bill. One would therefore expect that the proportion of confirmed victims in receipt of leave to remain would remain low, but it does not. In other words, this bill is currently, as it drafted, will perpetuate rather than address the current arrangements in which the vast majority of confirmed victims are denied leave to remain in the UK to help their recovery. The police have made it very clear they would wish this to be the case. They want them to be around so they can help them settle, have accommodation, know where they are, and they can give evidence. So I simply want to conclude what is a more complex point to my honourable friend. I am supportive of much of what this bill is trying to do, and I understand the motives behind it. But when it comes to Section 4, dealing with those with the most terrible backgrounds and the worst sort of persecutions, trafficked as they are, we need to also give them time. And that time will help us prosecute those very people we wish to get after. So being good and decent is also a payback to us at the same time. I support this bill, but I look for changes as it goes through on that section.
Thank you. We now go by video link to Kate Osama.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As we've heard today, this bill is deeply flawed, cruel and inhumane, which, if passed, would punish those who seek refuge from violence and persecution entering our country. This bill would see us abandon our internationally recognised duties, ultimately turning our back on the world's most vulnerable. Madam Deputy Speaker, under international law, there is no such thing as an illegal asylum seeker. Yet, if passed, this bill would seek to ignore that reality and establish a dangerous new precedent. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to briefly outline two of the most concerning aspects of this legislation. Firstly, I'm deeply concerned about the powers this bill would allow the government to create offshore camps in which it would detain refugees. There is no justification for such an inhumane practice. Wherever this has been tried, it has failed and put those who are subjected to it at risk of re-traumatisation. The Australian government's own report into its offshoring facility in Nauru revealed horrifying conditions, including the sexual abuse of women and children. Meanwhile, detention centres like Napier Barracks demonstrate clearly that this government is very comfortable housing asylum seekers in the most squalid conditions. Those conditions would only get worse if the government was allowed to move asylum centres offshore, out of reach of oversight and accountability. Secondly, as chair of the all-party group on no recourse to public funds, I'm particularly concerned that this bill would greatly expand the number of people who are subjected to that awful condition. This bill removes the automatic right to settle for those who secure refugee status, having travelled to the UK through another country. By introducing that condition, the government will substantially increase the number of people with no recourse to public funds. People who will no longer have the right to work will access homelessness assistance. In short, if this bill passes, a huge number of people will be forced into destitution. In closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the government was truly interested in fixing our asylum system, this bill would have contained new commitments to provide safe routes to this country, while ensuring that all those who claim asylum here are able to live a dignified life while they await a decision. Instead, the bill abandons our obligations under international law, criminalises refugees, and expands the cruel and inhumane no recourse to public funds regime. For those reasons, I will be voting against this bill, and I urge all members to do the same. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Natalie Elphick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Children separated forcibly from their parents at gunpoint, pregnant women held at knife point, babies and toddlers stripped of life jackets and dangled over the side of dinghies. Women, young women and girls disappearing, unaccounted for. Last known movements in the hands of criminal gangs known to be involved in modern slavery. Madam Deputy Speaker, this isn't happening in some faraway conflict zone. It isn't happening in a war-ridden country. It is happening here in our land and across the English Channel. Death, violence, sex trafficking, exploitation, bribery, guns, drugs, modern slavery, illegal migration. Make no mistake, this is the reality of the small boats crisis. And so where is the compassion in walking on by, in leaving families, young children, babies, in the hands of people traffickers and violent criminal gangs, when people are already safe in France and many other countries before they come to France? Then let me turn to the risk to our national security. Persons with criminal intent have been identified coming into Dover in boats picked up in the Channel. But any local person will tell you about the very many boats that do make it onto the land, onto the beaches, onto our shores, in the coastal villages of Kingsdown and St Margaret's and Walmer and further afield. And it happens so often, even today, even this very morning. We must be compassionate to people in greatest need. I believe that unites us on all sides of this House. But it would also be naive to the very real risks that some people actively do wish to do us harm, and they do harm others. And that's why, for our national security, we must have strong borders and bring an end to the small boats crossing route. Today's measures are not about a lack of compassion. It's about recognising that there is no compassion in allowing this illegal activity to continue. Today's bill, alongside its sister immigration reform bill, provides more powers to strengthen our borders, more options to work with other countries, to make sure that people are encouraged to use legal and safe routes and discouraged from using these dangerous and illegal ones. The bottom line is this: it's only when migrants and traffickers alike know that they can't break into Britain in this way that the small boats crossing route will come to an end.
Well done, Madam. Neil Coyle.
Thank you, and I refer to the register of interest because I've helped from the RAMP project on my work on this area. RAMP are brilliant in direct contrast to this bill. It's the worst I've ever seen. And this dog's dinner was avoidable if ministers listened to the evidence and experts, or even to the consultation responses, which they promised to publish and have failed to do so. I hope as they finalise this bill that they will do so. And it was strange, after 11 years of Conservative administration, to hear the Home Secretary admit at a second reading of her own bill that it was not yet complete in response to the question from the Parliament member Chingford. At a time of rising global crises, this is a government that could help prevent asylum seekers being created by intervening perhaps under global Britain. But that has sadly proved to be an empty slogan, often mouthed by emptier heads, given we have a government that has twice betrayed their own manifesto, and of course all the people who voted for it, in both cutting our aid and cutting our armed forces personnel, which means shrinking global reach and influence. And this is a government that is shrinking our international standing by seeking an exclusivism, a new and special status for the UK outside international law, but at direct detriment and cost to other countries, including our immediate neighbours. It is bonkers. But ministers present this fiction to us and have a real battle with reality ahead. It is a fiction to pretend we have deals with other countries to return anyone to, except Albania, a country we accept asylum claims from. It is a fiction to claim it is fair to criminalise someone fleeing communist torture and slave labour in Xinjiang, or fair to criminalise RNI volunteers or anyone on any boat that rescues asylum seekers from drowning. It is a fiction to claim it's fair on councils who already pay for Home Office failures and delays, but face additional costs through the rough sleeping these badges create and the estimated additional £55 million of new costs of these proposals, creating 3,000 more people experiencing the pernicious Home Office no recourse to public funds restrictions. And it is a fiction to pretend this is fair on taxpayers who will pick up the bill, whether it's through the Home Office, through councils, emergency social services, or the new criminal justice and imprisonment costs, which are estimated to be over £400 million a year. The only truth I heard from the Home Secretary today is that the system is broken, with the number of people waiting over a year for a decision rising tenfold since 2010, with 33,000 in that position in 2010, including almost 7,000 children. What's maddening is the number of people working for the Home Office has risen, but productivity has collapsed, with around 2,500 people now having waited 3 years or more for a decision. It is a decade of Tory rule that has broken the Home Office. The party who used to claim to represent law and order have run the Department of Law and Order into the ground, with 9 in 10 crimes now going unpunished in this country. But now ministers ask the Home Office to act unlawfully in pursuing an aim that breaks international law. Sadly, the idea that the people who broke the Home Office now have ideas to fix it is also a fiction. And I'll just end by saying, I'd ask ministers to think again about these plans, but there is so little evidence they put much thought into the bill in the first place.
Thank you. We now go by video link to Paula Barker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by paying tribute to some of the fantastic organisations who support people seeking asylum in my constituency, such as Asylum Link Merseyside, Merseyside Refugee Support Network and British Red Cross. Every day I see the difference they make in supporting some of the most vulnerable people in society who come to our country seeking refuge, only too often to find that their trauma suffering is made worse by the hostile environment this government has created for them. Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with the Home Secretary on one thing. Our asylum system is broken. However, that's where our consensus ends. Many aspects of this bill are objectionable, probably too many to mention in the time I have. The bill is a disgraceful attempt to make people seeking asylum pay the price for gross mismanagement of the asylum system by her and her predecessors. According to figures from the House of Commons Library, the Home Office asylum caseload has doubled since 2014. And I have constituents who have now been waiting for over 2 years for a decision, and many who have been waiting nearly 2 years for a substantive interview. The UNHCR put proposals to the government on fixing the asylum system based on their experience of best practice around the world. Instead of implementing these, the government has chosen to put forward a bill which undermines our international obligations and our standing in the world. I'm sure I am not alone in this House in being proud that the UK was a founding signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. It was then and is now an important legacy from the horrors of World War II and the many people who were displaced as a result. The UNHCR serves as a guardian of the Refugee Convention, and it is in its detailed observations about the measures within this bill, they have been clear that they disagree with the Home Secretary's statement that her proposals comply with our obligations under the Convention. They have stated that many aspects of the plan do not respect fundamental principles of refugee law and will undermine the 1951 Convention and international protection system, not just in the UK, but globally. Let nobody in this House be under any illusion. Supporting the measures in this bill will signal to the world we are withdrawing from our international obligations. In that context, why would any other country be willing to reach agreements with us on what the government described as safe and legal routes? I would appeal to honourable members on the government benches who value Britain's standing and reputation as a global leader. Don't let the government get away with undermining the sacrifices and achievements of the generation before us with this bill. I also call on the government to share with the House their legal advice which supports the Home Secretary's statement that the measures in the bill are compatible with our obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I believe everyone here wants to tackle people smuggling, human trafficking, and dangerous trips across the channel. The only way to do this is the one thing this bill does not do: provide safe, legal routes to sanctuary in the UK. Instead, this bill treats asylum seekers more harshly, despite no evidence that this approach will stop them trying to come here. The Home Office has been treating asylum seekers abysmally for years, keeping them in unsafe accommodation, making them wait months for a decision on their claim, banning them from working, and forcing them to rely on little more than £5 a day. If cruelty were the answer, the problem would have been solved long ago. And what about the legal routes to asylum that this government has promised? The number of people granted asylum in the UK fell by 46% last year. The number of children granted asylum fell by 55%. And the government's new scheme, which opened in March, resettled 25 refugees in its first month. Just 25. This compares to 477 per month on average under the previous schemes. The proposals under this bill are not just cruel, they undermine the UK's commitment under the Refugee Convention. We cannot simply rewrite them to suit ourselves. Liberal Democrats are calling for a fully funded commitment to resettle 10,000 vulnerable refugees each year. We should resettle a further 10,000 unaccompanied child refugees from elsewhere in Europe over the next 10 years, and we must guarantee the rights of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in Europe to be reunited with family members in the UK. There is another historic injustice, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this bill fails to address: comprehensive sickness insurance, no SCSI. A few years ago, many EU citizens had their application for a permanent resident document refused. These refusals were down to an obscure need for an insurance CSI that they never previously needed to live in the UK or use the NHS. At the time, the government insisted they were powerless to change this requirement as it stemmed from EU free movement laws. The requirement was removed from the EU settlement scheme, but CSI is still hidden deep within our rules. Many thousands of children have been cut off from their rights to be citizens of this country, all because of some obscure insurance requirement no one was told they needed to have. The government must come clean and use the exit from the EU for some good, as so often claimed. There's no more excuse to hold on to the CSI requirement for those seeking to become UK citizens. Rather than fixing the problem, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill will make the problems worse and fail those most in need. I will vote against them. Thank you very much.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is crucial that we restore trust in our immigration system. Our asylum system is in desperate need of reform, and our constituents rightly expect it to be fixed. In just the last year, 16,000 people have entered the country illegally, and these are just the ones that we know about. Now, some of these people are genuinely fleeing persecution and need our support, but others are not, and they may abuse the legal system, making repeated, vexatious and often last-minute claims, challenging the Home Office's ability to lawfully remove individuals in those cases and costing taxpayers a lot of money. It also creates a severe backlog which delays the processing of those genuine asylum cases and slows down our judicial processes. Most worryingly, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are now 10,000 foreign national offenders in circulation outside of prisons in the UK, whom the Home Office are intent on deporting, but currently cannot because of legal barriers. I welcome the government's new plan for immigration will speed up removal of these dangerous foreign criminals. Any foreign national who comes to this country and abuses our hospitality by breaking the law should be in no doubt of the UK government's determination to deport them. Madam Deputy Speaker, when assessing the need of individual asylum claims, knowing the age of applications is really, really important, ensuring that the children get protected and properly looked after. The UK is currently one of the very few countries in Europe that doesn't commission or employs scientific methods of age assessment when determining how old these young people are. As a consultant paediatrician, the welfare of children is of the utmost importance to me, and I have participated in the past in assessment of asylum-seeking children as a doctor, and the current system in place is nowhere near accurate enough for making such crucial and important decisions. And I welcome that this bill will enable the use of scientific age assessment techniques and that there will be increased research into their accuracy so that we can best direct our efforts to support the youngest and the most vulnerable people. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill addresses a number of anomalies in the system in relation to British nationality law. And behind each of these anomalies is a person, is a family. And I'm pleased to see a change in the law that I have lobbied for since 2019. Nationality for children whose fathers are not the husband of their mothers at the time of their birth. One of my constituents, Madam Deputy Speaker, who served his country on military operations, was shocked to discover he was unable to get British citizenship for his son, despite the fact that he is British and the son was born in Britain. This was because his European mother was still legally married to a foreign national at the time of their son's birth. And under the current legislation, a child's father is legally deemed to be the husband at the time the woman gives birth. However, in this particular case, my constituent is the father in all biological, emotional and practical terms. New measures in this bill will provide an entitlement to British citizenship for people who were previously unable to acquire it because their mother was married to someone other than their biological father at the time of birth. This will fix an outdated rule and ensure that my constituent and many others can rightfully pass on their nationality to their children. And I'm pleased to support this bill.
For the sake of clarity, I ought to reiterate what Mr. Speaker said to the House earlier today, as the Right Honourable Lady for Doncaster Central has been required to self-isolate and cannot therefore take her usual place in the chair. The Honourable Lady for Bradford South will shortly be taking the chair, having been appointed a temporary Deputy Speaker. And I hope that the House will be gentle with her. We now go by video link. We now go by video link to Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government states this bill is necessary to deter irregular journeys and to increase the fairness of the system to support those in need of asylum. And I think most of us in this House agree the system needs to be fairer. Lengthy waits for asylum applications to be processed are the norm. Immigration detention is often indefinite, and modern slavery and trafficking survivors are routinely detained. But as the Red Cross states, removing support and raising the penalties for those that arrive irregularly does not address the underlying reasons of why people seek safety in the UK. And this bill is brutal. It effectively punishes those desperate souls who often genuinely flee persecution, famine, and war in the hope of safety. As the Refugee Council have stated, the actual effect of the bill in its current form will be to punish refugees who have been recognised as such under international law and actually reduce safe and regular routes to the UK as refugee family reunion rights become more limited. One of the most dangerous parts of the proposals are that someone's means of arrival will determine how worthy they are of protection in the UK. Asylum seekers arriving through anything other than resettlement will receive a lesser form of protection, including temporary status, no access to financial support, and limited rights to family reunion. In fact, the new proposals plan to criminalise anyone arriving irregularly, so not through official channels. But as we all know, people fleeing atrocities are rarely afforded the luxury of arriving through official channels. And as the UN Refugee Agency have confirmed, this principle is in breach of the Refugee Convention. Madam Deputy Speaker, these are cruel and unworkable plans. And I agree with Amnesty International when they state, instead of introducing this piece of utter legislative vandalism, what the Home Office should be doing is establishing safe routes for the relatively few people escaping persecution who wish to seek asylum here. This reckless and deeply unjust bill is set to bring shame on Britain's international reputation. Thank you.
By video link, Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Dir Pilafarydd. This bill is an assault on the human rights of men and women who happen to be asylum seekers and on our common humanity. Across Wales, thousands of decent people are united. This legislation shames us, and it is not in our name. It expands the hostile environment by criminalising asylum seekers and their families. The bill's proposed tier system for claiming asylum rips up the basic tenets of the 1951 Refugee Convention, that people's mode of arrival should have no influence on whether they are legitimate refugees or on their right to make an asylum claim. The potential criminalisation of the life-saving work of organisations such as the RNLI is incomprehensible, and I commend the determination of our lifeboat crews to continue to come to the aid of anyone at peril on the sea. It threatens to penalise seafarers if they don't leave people to perish. And thus it scorns the UN Safety at Sea Convention, as well as the Refugee Convention. Expanding the use of detention-style asylum accommodation will result in more people being sent to sites such as Penally Camp in Pembrokeshire, described by the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration as impoverished, run down, and unsuitable for long-term accommodation. Let's not forget that the Home Office was shamed into closing Penally only 4 months ago. The human cost of these proposed changes would be immense. It would criminalise and prevent people such as Joseph Gnacbo from seeking sanctuary in the UK. After fleeing from the Ivory Coast following threats to his life, Joseph sought refuge in Wales. He now works as a carer, a translator, and a teacher, and volunteers for Cymdeithas yr Iaith, the Welsh Language Society. These are his words, and they are worth hearing. We are already treated as an inconvenience under the current asylum system. Under these reforms, we will be treated as criminals. The welcome I have received by the people of Wales in that time is in stark contrast with the Home Office's cruel policies. I want refugees and asylum seekers to have more help in integrating into Welsh society. Sadly, this legislation seeks to make that almost impossible. Wales, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a far richer place because of people like Joseph. But the Home Secretary would make a criminal of people such as him. We must stand up to this heartless Borders Bill, which prevents Wales from fulfilling the humane, honourable ambition of our own Parliament, namely to become a nation of sanctuary for refugees. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
And by video link, Henry Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I speak this evening in support of the Nationality and Borders Bill because the current system is not working either for the interests of nationality or UK borders. It cannot be right that over the last year, an estimated 16,000 people have entered this country illegally. And of course, that is during a period when international travel has been severely restricted because of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is right that the system is changed and updated so that people coming to the United Kingdom should do so on a legal basis and not circumvent that system that exists. And the suggestion that those coming to this country from continental Europe are fleeing persecution in those countries is ridiculous. There is no analogy with the situation that existed in Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s. But this evening, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wanted to mention one other aspect of nationality that hasn't been properly addressed, and that is those who are descendants of the Chagos Islanders who were forcibly removed by the Harold Wilson administration in the late 1960s from the British Indian Ocean Territory and typically were resettled in Mauritius, the Seychelles and some other locations. Many of those descendants, grandchildren of people who were British subjects on the British Indian Ocean Territory now find themselves effectively with no rights to British citizenship, despite the fact that it was no fault of their own that their grandparents and relatives were forcibly exiled from their home territory. And therefore, I would be grateful if the government would consider a clause to this bill to rectify that anomaly, which affects a relatively small number of people, but is an injustice that has existed for over half a century. I plan to introduce an amendment at report stage of this bill, but I hope the government can work with me to once and for all remedy this historical injustice. Thank you.
And by video link, Jane Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to have the chance to speak in this debate, though I regret the time limit means my comments will be very brief. This important bill aims to give a fair and safe asylum system and give greater rights and greater protections to those who've legally sought asylum in the UK. The bill seeks to properly control our borders, which will strengthen our national security, and the bill will clamp down on some of the most despicable criminals, the gangs of criminals who make money from people smuggling and involvement in modern slavery. And for me, this is the most important part of the bill. We all in this place should back any measures that will stop this trade in human misery. We all remember the tragic deaths of migrants who paid smugglers to cram them into lorries without sufficient ventilation. We've seen people with no sailing experience who paid to be piled into unseaworthy vessels, often nothing more than a dinghy, and then pushed offshore to make a dangerous and tragically often deadly sea crossing. It's the duty of our Home Secretary to take any measures she can to stop these perilous attempts to enter the UK, and I thank her for her clear commitment to reform the system and stop these organised criminals. And let's be clear, while these journeys are deemed to be viable, others will attempt the same journeys. We must act to stop them. As my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, mentioned, many who seek to come to the UK by illegal routes are economic migrants. And if I had more time, I'd speak about the work the UK is doing in trade and in education, and the work we should do going forward to help developing countries really develop, so that people all over the world can have prosperous, fulfilling lives for themselves and their families. Excuse me. I was deeply disappointed by the Shadow Home Secretary's remarks about this bill creating a more discriminatory asylum system, because by not supporting measures in this bill, he allows the current system to continue. He must surely look at the current system and see the clear discrimination against older people, disabled people, women and children, against anyone unable or less able to make these long, arduous, dangerous journeys. As I only have a few more seconds, I'll conclude by saying we should all want a fair and just asylum system. And a fair and just asylum system does not say that if you're young enough, fit enough, or brave enough, you can get ahead and jump the queue. A fair and just asylum system does not reward organised gangs of criminals for putting vulnerable people's lives at risk. A fair and just asylum system is not this perverse and deadly real-life Hunger Games. It's why we must act, and it's why I support the Home Secretary's measures. I commend her determination to stop these vile, inhumane practices. Thank you.
Brady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I hope you're enjoying the view. Congratulations. I sometimes wonder if the Home Secretary or her cheerleaders on the government benches have ever actually met an asylum seeker, because if the asylum seekers that come to my surgeries in Glasgow North find that it's stressful or embarrassing or upsetting to have to carry a biometric ID card that states they have no right to work when, being a human being, they're born with that right, or that they have no recourse to public funds, then from the other side of the surgery table, it is no less humiliating to have to explain why the government is so unremittingly hostile to their presence in this country. It's easy to stand at the dispatch box or the back benches and say these people should leave the UK. Try looking them in the eyes that have seen horrors that some of us can't even imagine, and say that. I defy any minister or any Tory backbencher to come to the next meeting of the Maryhill Integration Network Voices meeting, listen to the testimonies of the men and women who take part, and then come back to this House and justify the policies that they're promoting today. For 20 years, the Maryhill Integration Network has supported asylum seekers and refugees in the north of Glasgow, welcoming them into the community, helping share experiences, culture, food, joy across the entire city. And for 17 of those years, it's been led by the remarkable Rima Sharifi until her recent retirement. She was a refugee, a journalist in Kosovo who fled a refugee camp in Macedonia with her family before being evacuated to Glasgow for health reasons, and since that time has worked tirelessly to support thousands of others who have been through similar experiencing, helping people overcome traumas and learn how to make new lives as part of Glasgow's wonderfully diverse community. My friend and constituent Abdul Bastani has a similar story. Fled the Taliban at the age of 18, arrived in the UK, was put on a bus to Glasgow, a city he'd never heard of. 20 years later, a proud father, works in translation, runs Afghan United, which brings people together in sport, language, culture, and other activities. How many more Rimas and Abduls are out there and are now going, who could help transform our country, make it a better place for everyone, but instead are going to find themselves shut out, turned away, criminalised by this bill, put up in barracks before being deported, criminalised on the moment of arrival, because of course they had to struggle to get here. The repressive regime wasn't giving them a passport and a ticket to an airport. Hostility is the hallmark of this government. Hostility to devolution, hostility to the aid budget, and now a supercharging of the hostile environment for refugees and asylum seekers. A hostile environment that pervades the Home Office. The visa system is at least as much as a mess as the other asylum system, and it amounts to one message: global Britain is closed. Don't come here unless you're going to spend a lot of money and then leave again very quickly. I also agree with the Honourable Member for Crawley on his points about the Chagosians. Well, Scotland wants no part of it. In time, Scotland will have its own immigration system, and just as Scots have been welcomed and made their homes in countries around the world, we will welcome travellers, migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, respecting their human rights and our humanitarian responsibilities. To refugee and asylum seeking constituents in Glasgow North, no matter what you hear from the Tory dispatch box today, you are welcome in Glasgow, you are welcome in Scotland. We want you to be safe and we want you to stay.
Hear, hear.
Sarah Brickley.
Deputy Speaker, I was elected in 2019 on a manifesto which promised to reform our immigration system. For too long, excessive and uncontrolled immigration and abuses of our asylum system have allowed people to get around the rules without much prospect of ever being removed once they're here. This bill is an important turning point. It provides the powers we need to remove people who should not be here and to discourage anyone who would try to cross into the country illegally. The message is simple. If you come here illegally by irregular means, you won't be staying. This bill has three main objectives. First, to increase the fairness of the system to better protect and support those in need of asylum. Second, to deter illegal entry into the United Kingdom, thereby breaking people smuggling networks and protecting the lives of those they endanger. Third, to remove those with no right to be in the UK more easily. These aims are sensible, proportionate and just. They're also what the public want us to do. Whenever I'm out and about in Harman and Haslingden, I hear concerns from residents about controlling our borders and cracking down on illegal immigration. There is a proper asylum route into this country, and it's important that people realise they will be punished if they don't follow it. This bill will not only deter the people who get in the boats to make illegal crossings, but will smash the networks which brings them here. There are no words strong enough to express my contempt for the traffickers who give people false hope and then risk their lives by unscrupulously smuggling them into the country for a huge fee. We need an asylum system which is compassionate with people who apply to come here, processes claims efficiently and effectively, and quickly removes anyone who is not successful in their application. And this bill delivers on all of that. The bill will broaden criminal sanctions for offences related to illegal entry and for bringing people here illegally, and will increase the maximum penalties for both. It will also give border and immigration staff additional powers to stop and redirect vessels out of the UK territorial waters. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is an important step in creating a new immigration system based on merit, which controls who, when and how people can come here and cuts immigration overall. It gives my constituents the confidence that the government has heard their concerns on immigration and is working to tackle them.
Video link, Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Judge while seeking justice, criminalised while fleeing criminals, expelled while being exploited, scapegoated while escaping some of the worst violations against human dignity or human rights in breach of global agreements. The words in this bill should never enter the minds of anyone, let alone those entrusted to protect us. They should never be echoed in this chamber, let alone brought forward in legislation. In our country, the place which founded human rights, governments have reached the depths of stigmatising people fleeing war, terror, trafficking, climate catastrophe, and yes, destitution, judging them how they arrive, not what they have left. As this government plays on the global stage, cutting aid to the world's poor is removing the last hope of being able to stay home and to support family and community. As they play with our climate, which is burning our planet, and every grain that could feed the most destitute. As they play war, selling arms while walking away from building peace. As they fail to use their voice, power and influence on the the global stage to stem some of the worst violations against humanity, as it presides over a broken asylum system, not fixing it. This government must recognise its contribution to the decimation of the global order before pointing the blame at its victims. From its centuries of imperial abuse to withdrawing from reparation today, this government is now prepared to suppress the small number of the 80 million people who today are forced from their homes and land, who are without shelter or hope, to then turn people who have been subject to criminal gangs to be criminalised themselves for the want of safety and survival, and some just to be reunited with their families. Worse, this legislation will stop people even fleeing danger, as they force people to apply to enter the UK from a place of peril or some offshore hidden place, creating more risk, more trauma, more harm. I appeal to all members opposite not to tread these dark paths. I appeal to all who say they live by a moral code, that are here to further justice, that are here to advance human rights. Do not support your government tonight, but uphold our British values, which welcomes the oppressed and somewhere for people to live safely. I'm so proud to represent the UK's only human rights city and city of sanctuary here in York, where we put the needs of others before our own, where we tear down walls and create bridges, and where we take care of those whose stories break us as they recount the trauma that their lives have endured. We listen, we act, we quicken our resolve to speak up and stand up against for human rights and against violations and abuses. And that is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have spoken out today to oppose this oppressive legislation and say, not in my name.
Sir John Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Welcome to the chair. Edmund Burke said that justice is itself the great standing policy of civil society, and any eminent departure from it under any circumstances lies under the suspicion of being no policy at all. Restoring justice and order to the current chaotic and confusing asylum system broadcasts the line in the sand has been drawn, which will not fade away with every new boat that arrives on the beach. The bill before us today is a testament to the principle that laws must be just and be seen to be, for otherwise we can hardly call them law at all. According to poll after poll, the vast majority of the public see illegal immigration as a serious problem. And is it any wonder when there were 16,000 illegal entrants into Britain last year, and those are the ones we know about, 8,500 on boats. This year alone, there have been 7,000 arriving on those boats. I happily go away.
Very great, my honourable friend. Does he not think that somehow turning into a sort of simple, everyone who claims asylum must have a legitimate claim, and everyone who's against it must be racist, doesn't help in trying to get to that just law that he's talking about?
Absolutely not. And to pillory the public and those who speak for them, who, when they argue that we should indeed enforce the law, the migration should be controlled. The legal migration has been out of control, as a number of contributors to the debate have said for some time, but the illegal migration is by its very nature both unjust and unfair, because it breaks the law. It breaches that principle that people who arrive here and pursue legal routes are doing the right thing, and those that don't are simply doing the wrong thing and should be deported. That's what the public think, and that's what we should be saying very clearly. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Is there nobody on the Conservative benches at all remotely concerned that this bill would see a Uyghur fleeing persecution in China, or a Syrian fleeing disastrous war crimes in that country, or a persecuted Christian seeking sanctuary on this shore criminalised with an offence that could see them in prison for up to 4 years, stripped of family reunion rights, offshored, and whatever else? Is there nobody on the benches opposite that has any qualms about that whatsoever?
Must understand. Surely he must realise that whilst the principle of granting asylum, of giving sanctuary to people in desperate need, is a noble one, it is being gamed. And it's being gamed day after day and month after month. People travelling through many safe countries before claiming asylum, repeated claims on a whole range of different grounds, even modern slavery, which we all deplore, being used as a justification to stay here when it is invented. And that is to insult, to besmirch those who are really suffering persecution, who come here in genuine need. And it is gained, frankly, by a combination of unscrupulous civil rights and human rights activists and people traffickers. And whilst they don't work together in an organised fashion, their combination of the two is damaging public faith and our ability to control our borders. And if take back control means anything, surely it means taking back control of our sovereign borders. When the average Briton sees the asylum system being played, it leaves them bewildered, frustrated and angry that we should be taken with such fools. British people do not want to pull up the drawbridge to the world's needy. What they want is a consistent system that helps the right people in the right way. One that will remove those with no right to stay in Britain, just as protects those who we ought to be protecting. Not one which grants favour to those who manage to successfully break our laws when they first arrive here. Happily away.
Thank you. I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. And contrary to what the opposition is saying, does he agree with me that the government is not changing its approach to maritime law, and in fact anybody who was at distress, anybody who was still at distress at sea, those organisations and individuals will still be able to rescue them at that point?
As the honourable lady may know, I'm a former maritime minister, and it is absolutely right that the IMO and the agreement that we have to rescue people at sea is again being exploited by unscrupulous people, and we need to be mindful of that fact. This bill goes some way to addressing the huge gulf that exists between public perceptions and that of the liberal establishment that have too much say about too many things in this country. Criminal gangs, desperate economic migrants know that bleeding heart liberals when they blur the distinction between those in genuine need and those who break the rules. Every time they oppose tougher penalties and tougher measures, do immense harm to the cause of genuine asylum seekers. And finally, let me say a word about foreign criminals because they've been mentioned. 4,000 foreign criminals here in 2010, now 10,000. Surely everyone should be deported. We do not want to import crime to our country. We must take back control and we must pass this bill to do so.
Angela Crawley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome you to your role. I am grateful to have the opportunity to contribute to today's debate and to follow several honourable members who have spoken so eloquently in this bill, sadly for the most part on this side of the House. My colleagues and I will oppose this abhorrent legislation that rides roughshod over the Refugee Convention. As we approach the 50th anniversary of the Convention, it places some of the most vulnerable people in the world at risk of destitution, exploitation and family separation, and this government's rhetoric and virtue signalling fails to comprehend the valuable contributions that they make to our society, regardless of how they got here. If this legislation is passed, it will cast the UK adrift from international law, as we've heard, making it more isolated from other countries and staining what's already left of our international reputation on the world stage. It is insensitive, rushed and deeply problematic given its intention to effectively end the right to seek asylum in the UK, and by doing so, it contravenes the Refugee Convention itself and also the European Convention on Human Rights. The bill proposes a two-tier system and a two-tier approach to asylum, despite there being no legal requirement in international law for an applicant to seek asylum in the first country they reach. Now, by bringing this bill forward, the Home Secretary is now ignoring both the international and the UK law with her approach, as well as being blind to the fact that how an applicant arrives in the UK is unrelated to the level of protection that they require. The Home Secretary encourages asylum seekers to use official schemes to make their application, fully aware that in many cases, the abhorrent regimes that any asylum seeker is seeking to seek refuge from will place them and their families at greater risk. It faces this risk that many asylum seekers face is not a choice that they make freely, it's a choice that they have simply because it is the only choice they have left. To turn to criminal gangs for help, leaving them open to exploitation. The UK simply cannot depart from international law on an issue that requires cooperation with other countries, and by doing so refuse to play their part in supporting some of the world's most vulnerable citizens. This bill is shoddy and it vandalises the UK's international reputation and undermines the devolution settlement itself. The Home Secretary's... I will give way.
Local government is giving way. Stoke-on-Trent, which I'm proud to represent, has the 5th highest rate of asylum seekers per 10,000 population, Glasgow being the first. Does she agree with me that the SNP-led councils outside of Glasgow should step up and do their bit and start being part of the asylum dispersal scheme?
Thank the Honourable Member for that comment. Feel free to fund Glasgow City Council to deal with this situation that frankly your government has caused. But most importantly, it ignores the reality of why people flee in the first place and seek safety. The willful ignorance and lies within this bill's severest risk of harm to refugees seeking protection in the UK. This bill would put the continued use of military-style barracks at the heart of the Home Office strategy, flying in the face of court rulings and expert opinion, including the NHS and the Public Health England. Their use of this has been ruled as unlawful, and the court has banned this by a decision of the High Court. If the Honourable Member wishes to make a further intervention, I will take it, otherwise I'll carry on. It's simply astonishing that the Home Office casually disregard this ruling and the views of the public health experts, placing this practice at the heart of the bill. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I come to my final remarks. This bill is one of the many reasons that Scotland needs her independence, and to break away from this insular Little Britain that the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister are working to create. These are real people, these are real lives, and someone should arrive here illegally by this government's definition, by exploitation or worse, should be penalised for the very notion that they make it here at all successfully is absolutely abhorrent. This place should be regarded as a safe haven. The UK is that opportunity for many, many people. This government turns their backs on so many lives.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now then, Yanis Bitter was 13 years old and living in Latvia at the start of World War II. And 2 years later, the Nazis came, and their request was simple. One male member from each family to go and fight the Russians. It was either Yanis, his dad, or his younger brother. So Yanis went to the Russian front and witnessed the horrors of war in temperatures of -40. And when the war ended in 1945, Yanis was classed as a displaced person, a refugee. Imagine that. He couldn't go back to Latvia because he'd been sent straight to Siberia, and that's where they sent his dad. So Yanis was given two more choices, either the USA or the UK. So he came to the UK, to a small village in Derbyshire, where he and other refugees were housed in Nissen huts, in army barracks. They didn't complain or whinge or moan about the barracks or set fire to the barracks or make TikTok videos. In fact, they were so grateful to the UK that they all volunteered to work in the fields at local farms, picking potatoes and any other seasonal vegetables for no pay. Yanis met a girl in the village, he fell in love, and he later married. He worked hard all his life and had 3 sons, one of them being Alan in Ashfield. Yanis loved his football. He became a British citizen and loved this country. He even went on to meet our Queen. Now, Yanis is no longer with us, but his story makes me feel incredibly proud of our great country and its willingness to help people from all over the world. I'm going to give way.
The story he's telling is a story of someone who sought our aid and got it. But would he contrast that with what's happening now? And wouldn't Yanis take the view that's been articulated in this chamber tonight, that the system now that he held in such high regard is being gamed, is being exploited, he's besmirching the good name of our country and people like him?
Thank my right honourable friend for his comments, and he's absolutely right. Because I spoke to Yanis's family last week in Ashfield, and they made exactly that point, and I will feed that back to them when I get back to Ashfield this weekend. But my point is, like I say, we've always been a welcoming and tolerant country that's reached out to genuine refugees from all over the world. But just like Yanis's family in Ashfield, most people in the UK do not accept that people travelling here from France in dinghies are genuine asylum seekers. They're not genuine asylum seekers. We know that many of them have been trafficked with a clear instruction on how to claim asylum once they get here. And that's because our asylum system is not fit for purpose. And this bill stops that. Now, the Labour Party and the opposition, they want to bring back free movement. They dislike our points-based immigration system. And now they're going to vote against a bill that protects our borders and helps deport foreign murderers and rapists. They will always vote against the British people. This new bill will ensure that people in genuine need, like Yarnis from all those years ago, will get the help they need, and the greedy lawyers and the human traffickers will be told no more. We owe it to people like Yarnis who are suffering today to ensure we have a fairer system which will offer genuine refuge and genuine refugees a safe haven. This bill does that. We have nothing to be ashamed of in this country. We are a kind, tolerant and welcoming country. And that's proven by the amount of people who risk their lives every single day to get here. And if the family of Yarnis can see the current situation is unacceptable, then surely the opposition should see that too. And I want to pay a massive thanks here to the Home Secretary who stuck to her guns. She has listened to the British people. She's delivered. And the MPs opposite, they want to travel into reality. And I'll offer this opportunity to all of you now sat there with those glazed expressions on your face. Come up to Ashfield or come down to Ashfield. Come and speak to some real people in my towns, in my villages, and the message you'll get will be completely different from the message you're feeding into this house. So I'm here because of you lot and the attitudes you had in 2019. We're getting tough on crime, we're getting tough on immigration, and we're getting tough on law and order.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Congratulations on taking the chair. I'm delighted to see you there. Every year or two, we hear from a Conservative Home Secretary that they're going to fix the broken system. The Home Secretary again has told us tonight the system is broken. And of course, she's right. It is broken. And all the previous attempts that we've heard exactly the same things about in the past haven't fixed it, and this one isn't going to either. I cannot agree with the thinking in this bill that making life more miserable for people whose circumstances are already utterly miserable will fix these problems and deter them from their desperate efforts to reach the UK. Most people think that distinguishing between asylum seekers on the basis of their route to the UK is contrary to the 1951 Refugee Convention. No doubt that is going to end up in the courts. I'm particularly dismayed with plans to process asylum applications overseas. We've got no idea where this is going to happen. We certainly should know before we agree this bill. Australia's got offshore facilities in Papua New Guinea and Nauru, although nobody's been sent there since 2013. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees urged that they should be evacuated because of poor health standards, highlighting in particular the number of suicides there. Those facilities shame Australia, and if we go down the same road, it will shame us as well. The long wait for asylum decisions is a massive problem, and I asked the Home Secretary about this earlier on. There are 50% more asylum caseworkers now than there were in 2014 to 15, but the number of decisions they make has gone down every single year in that time. Why has productivity fallen so far? I asked the Home Secretary that, she didn't give me an answer, but without fixing that problem, things are just going to carry on getting worse. The number waiting over a year for initial decisions, as we've been reminded repeatedly in this debate, has risen tenfold since 2010. I see that in constituency surgeries. People wait for years. They've got no idea when they'll hear anything. Sometimes a reply to me is the only way they know they actually are in the Home Office system. They've got no other evidence that they are. I very strongly support my right honourable friend's proposal for legally binding targets to process asylum cases more quickly. If people cannot stay, they should be told soon, not as happens so often at the moment after years, so that leaving is impractical, and in practice hardly ever happens. The current gross inefficiency helps nobody. I hope the House will reject this bill.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So our United Kingdom has always stood up for those in need, whether it be the thousands escaping fascism from Europe in the 20th century, or offering a home to the people of Hong Kong who face persecution at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, an adopted Stokey, is right to say our asylum system is broken. People in Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Torque will see images of people crossing the channel illegally in small boats and are rightly infuriated because they know the impact illegal immigration has. In Stoke-on-Trent, we have done more than almost any other area in giving asylum seekers a home. At the end of 2020, we had the 5th highest rate of asylum seekers per 10,000 population in the whole of the UK, housing over 1,000 asylum seekers. That means that 1 in every 250 people living in Stoke is now an asylum seeker. And with the certainty of even more illegal entries into the UK on boats, in lorries, or arriving without visas, this will push places like Stoke-on-Trent to their limit. In 14 council wards, the 1 in 200 cluster limit has already been breached in Stoke-on-Trent, with Achurin Hanley, a ward that I share with my honourable friend and member for Stoke-on-Trent Central, having a ratio of 1 in 44. The stark truth is that our city has reached its limits. Services such as our local NHS and schools are under strain and being stretched even further. And I fully support Stoke-on-Trent City Council leader Councillor Abby Brown's decision to pause our involvement with the Asylum Dispersal scheme. I'm happy to give way to honourable gentleman.
Perhaps some of the asylum seekers in his constituency could be given the right to work and then could work in the schools and hospitals, and the whole community could benefit from the growth, the economic, cultural and social growth that they would bring, rather than demonising and othering them and making people afraid of them.
I see the honourable member opposite getting very animated. I just hope he can convince his SNP colleagues to actually, or the Nats, to actually get involved in the asylum dispersal scheme. I know the Minister will be very keen for meetings tomorrow to start the paperwork, and let's have lots more councils in Scotland taking part in the asylum dispersal scheme. I'm happy to give way to lady.
I thank the honourable member for taking my intervention. He keeps saying this, as do many of his colleagues. Myself and the honourable member for Cumbernauld, South and Kirkintilloch, he's met with COSLA last week, who said, and as they've said so many times before, every one of the other 31 local authorities in Scotland would be happy to get involved in the asylum dispersal scheme if it were funded. Why shouldn't it be funded? Does the honourable member agree that it should be properly funded?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, Stoke-on-Trent sadly has the second lowest council tax revenue income than any other local authority in England. And all I'm hearing opposite is excuses, excuses, excuses. The SNP has money for all these vanity projects, but they don't have any money to look after asylum seekers. I find it baffling, but by creating new accommodation centres, removing asylum seekers to a safe third country whilst asylum claim is pending, in the same way as being done in Denmark, increasing maximum penalties for entering the UK illegally, enabling quicker and easier removal of foreign criminals convicted of horrific crimes such as rape and murder, creating new safe and legal routes which will be looked on favourably when people apply for asylum, and backing our border force to stop and redirect boats out of British waters, returning them to safe countries from which they came, such as France. This bill is delivering the reforms that we need and are wanted by the people of Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Talk. I'm more than happy to give way to the honourable lady.
For giving way. Does he accept that the picture that he paints is not the same as the picture that we experience in Scotland? In Glasgow, in Kenmure Street, people wrapped themselves around those who were being deported by the Home Office and said refugees are welcome. The picture you paint is not representative of the whole of the UK. It is inaccurate and it is false.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have the greatest respect for the people of Glasgow, their council and their members of parliament, because they have got involved in the asylum dispersal scheme and they deserve full recognition and credit for that. And just like Stoke-on-Trent has wrapped its arms around the people who have come to this country in need and looked after them, but we have simply said that our NHS, our local schools, our local council services cannot do this anymore, and it simply has to come to a point where fairness is applied equally. So I say to the honourable lady again, if all the SNP councils that aren't in Glasgow want to go and meet with the Minister, get the meeting, get the asylum dispersal scheme signed up to, and let's share the load across our country. But let's talk about the Labour Party, Madam Deputy Speaker, who will listen to the woke mob on Twitter rather than listening to the people in former Red Wall seats. The Labour Party want to sign back up to free movement, with the leader of the Labour Party spent years arguing for when trying to block Brexit, and who also believes that immigration controls are racist. I suggest the Labour Party, Champagne Socialists of North Islington, whose Labour-run council had not given accommodation to a single asylum seeker by the end of 2020, and their lefty-sponging lawyer friends who soak up taxpayers' money by preventing foreign criminals from being deported, should get out and talk to some real people rather than worrying about their likes on Twitter. The truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, the people of Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Talk want to take back control, and this bill delivers that.
Alan Durans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Good evening and welcome to the Chair. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a sad fact that in our broken world, forced migration is a reality. United government ministers may wish for people to stop trying to cross the English Channel, but when there is still conflict and injustice in the world, then there will always be those wanting to seek sanctuary from war and suffering. I will.
The Honourable Gentleman talks about conflicts and suffering, and of course we deplore that on both sides of the House. But I'm not aware that that conflict and suffering is in France, which, much as though I deplore many aspects of French civilization, including their attitude to the monarchy, nevertheless is a G7, a G20, a founder member of the United Nations. And so I don't understand why it is that he feels that we need to give safe home to those that are already in a fellow G7 member state.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. They are fleeing conflict and war. It may not be in France, but they are fleeing it from their own countries where they're in severe danger of losing their lives.
Just one more time, could he clarify, is in his view, France a safe country?
It is a safe country, but these asylum seekers are travelling from war-torn countries where their lives are in danger. I'll continue, Madam Deputy Speaker. We cannot close the door, and instead we need to call out this policy for what it is: xenophobic populism which exploits people's fear of the outsider. Madam Deputy Speaker, these are not my words. They are the words of Susan Brown, a leading member of the Church of Scotland and honorary chaplain to the Queen in Scotland, after seeing the consultation paper on this bill. Susan clearly does not believe in myths such as that immigrants are drain on the NHS or the benefit system, or that they bring increases in violent crime with them. For her, this is about being the kind of people we'd want to be, treating others as we would hope to be treated, and our families where the roles reversed. Some may argue that strict immigration policies are necessary to protect our borders and our country from the effects of immigration. However, our NHS staffing is good for the NHS. Migrants are an essential part of the healthcare workforce. They are the consultants, doctors, nurses, porters, cleaners, canteen staff, and other people who look after the nation. 13.3% of NHS staff in hospitals and community services in England reported a non-British nationality. Among doctors, that proportion is 28.4%. Many doctors trained abroad, and in March 2019, 20% of GPs in England qualified outside the UK. Immigration is a necessary part of the British way of life. On healthcare, Madam Deputy Speaker, demand amongst migrants to the UK is lower than amongst UK-born population, except inpatients for childbirth. In Scotland, migrants from outside the UK are in general young and have low healthcare needs. Consequently, there is little evidence of increased demand for health services. And on benefits, foreign-born people are less likely to receive key DWP out-of-work benefits than UK-born. On crime, in Scotland, statistics for individual crime participation tend to show that migrants are less likely to commit crime than observably similar people who are born in the United Kingdom. So to return, Madam Deputy Speaker, to Susan Brown of the Church of Scotland, who says, what we need is political leadership which acknowledges and allays people's concerns and promotes the importance of human life and dignity. This means giving asylum seekers the right to work, establishing safe passage routes on humanitarian corridors to the UK for those that need sanctuary, and support for individuals to alleviate destitution and poverty. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would urge this government to seriously reconsider many aspects of this bill and to adopt a more appropriate economic and humanitarian approach to nationality and immigration. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Jack Brereton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome you to your elevated position. Many of my constituents in Stoke-on-Trent South are shocked and angered by the illegal crossings of the English Channel. The integrity of our borders are broken, and my constituents are fed up of seeing people continue to enter the UK illegally. We must act to put an end to the profiteering of criminal people traffickers, for whom illegal routes have become an industry. And we must deter those who seek to make these perilous journeys across the busiest shipping lane in the world in no more than a rubber dinghy. Clearly, there must be safe routes for those in desperate need, The UK and Stoke-on-Trent has a proud record of helping those in greatest need. But what my constituents cannot understand is why there should be any need to make illegal journeys to do so. European countries are safe, and those attempting to claim asylum should do so in these countries. We have seen repeated attempts to game the system using any legal loophole to do so. There were 16,000 illegal immigrants last year, yet because of the system is overwhelmed and repeatedly abused, deportations are declining. The increased pressures we've seen on the entire immigration system has put enormous weight on those few asylum dispersal areas. Stoke-on-Trent has seen one of the highest proportions of refugees in the entire country. All the pressure, absolutely.
Does he accept the criticism received from his former colleague, Anna Soubry, who outlined that this party is now a Trumpian far-right populist party?
I would not. I do not agree with that. I think we have been absolutely supporting those in most desperate need. It's about making sure that actually the genuine ones in those countries in the region, we've supported around 25,000 over the last 6 years in this country, highest in the whole of Europe. So we won't take any lectures from the SNP, who do talk so much about the support for immigrants, but don't do a single thing. The only city in Scotland, Glasgow, is the only city that is a dispersal area. The rest of Scotland does not lift a single finger to help asylum seekers.
Stoke does all the heavy lifting.
We do, as I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent North. It is cities like Stoke-on-Trent that actually put the effort in. I will.
The outline that he states that only Glasgow is the only place in Scotland that accepts refugees is untrue. South Lanarkshire, my local authority, accepted a number of refugees, particularly post-2014. I don't have the numbers, but I'm telling you, the facts that you state are untrue.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Glasgow is the only official asylum dispersal area in Scotland. Other authorities have the opportunity to come forward as dispersal areas. SNP-controlled authorities in Scotland have failed to do so. All the pressure has fallen on those minority of authorities who are dispersal areas, whilst numerous authorities have failed to resettle a single asylum seeker. The West Midlands is currently accommodating 12.26%, an increase on 2019. But all of this is falling on only half of the authorities in the region. So in Stoke-on-Trent, this is having a very significant impact on our overstretched local services.
For giving way, and perhaps you could join our delegation tomorrow, because what we seek and what the Cross-Party Home Affairs Committee has advised is that the Home Office properly funds the dispersal system. Every single local authority in Scotland got involved in the refugee resettlement scheme because it was properly funded. More than happy to join him in seeking more money for dispersal areas, and then we'll all happily sign up to do that job properly as well.
What the honourable gentleman is actually saying is that he's happy for authorities like Stoke-on-Trent to continue to pull their weight, and we'll just sit here in Scotland and not pull our weight and continue to not support asylum seekers in this country.
The Scottish Government has published a new Scots plan to welcome asylum and asylum seekers and refugees right across the entire country. But if they don't want to give us the money, why don't they give us the power? And then we can have our own immigration system in Scotland.
Some progress, as I've got very little time. And there are currently around 10,000 national foreign offenders in this country. And again, the Labour Party, they will not do anything about this. They try to accept murderers and rapists who are allowed to come into this country. We in Stoke-on-Trent, we will not allow this. And as I've said, the pressures faced by those who have done the most is totally unsustainable. It saw all resettlement area authorities in the region withdraw from the scheme recently. Since then, we've continued to see attempts to place people, and the latest letter from the Minister, although I do thank the Minister for the support he's given, says that there will continue to be people procured in these areas against our wishes. I totally recognise the urgent need for these areas to house people, but this cannot continue to fall on those few areas of the country. I do think it is time that those other areas of the country do step up and do what they should be in terms of making a fair share and contributing, like Stoke-on-Trent has and continued to do so.
And then by video link, Belle Riviera Abbey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's only one thing on which me and the Home Secretary would agree on today, and that's that we have a failed and broken immigration system that costs far too much money. But this is because of successive Conservative governments that have failed it and broken it, and an incompetent and chaotic Home Office which continues to preside over it. When you constantly have to pay out claims for wrongful decisions and outsource immigration detention and asylum accommodation, it costs money and misery. Over 50% of those in immigration detention, I might add, actually end up staying in this country. What an absolute waste. So extending the estate will only enrich companies like Serco and G4S, which is why the plan to extend the immigration detention estate makes no sense to me when the pandemic has proven that it can be managed another way. If the government wants to save money, it should simply end immigration detention. Madam Deputy Speaker, this horrendous piece of legislation hailed as a solution does nothing to resolve these issues. It does nothing to create safe routes for refugees, nothing to end the hostile environment, nothing to end the danger of unsafe asylum accommodation, and nothing to address the bureaucratic hurdles that leave people without documentation through no fault of their own. We're living through an age of mass displacement driven by war, poverty and climate breakdown. And under the Refugee Convention, anyone seeking asylum should be able to claim in their intended destination or another safe country. Asylum seekers are under no obligation to seek refuge in the first country they arrive in, and there are a number of reasons why they may not do this. It's times like this that the government shouldn't be dodging their moral and legal obligations to accept their fair share of refugees. Instead of creating a fair and humane system, this bill, coupled with the government's new plan, actually discriminates by distinguishing people fleeing the same persecution by something as irrelevant as how they arrived. Does the Home Secretary realise that a trafficked woman can't stop and ask her handler to ensure that she arrived on the correct documentation? And LGBTQ people and those fleeing political and religious persecution can't do a Google search to find out what mode might be considered the most favourable. And that an unaccompanied minor stripped from everything and everyone they know doesn't have the luxury of ticking the correct box. These people are fleeing conditions some of us could never imagine, and these plans will limit the options of those most in need and create a two-tier system that will ruin lives. It is 100% a misrepresentation that this legislation meets obligations under international law. And don't take my word for it. You've heard time and time again today, this is the view of the United Nations. And actually the opinions of those lawyers that the Home Secretary seeks to demonise today. And to all of those campaigns and lawyers that continue to support migrants' rights, I want them to know that no matter what is said about you from the Conservative benches, you are absolute heroes. And long after this government is done away with, you will be on the right side of history. This is yet more of this government's authoritarian agenda, turning away the most vulnerable. And as the late, great Tony Benn once said, the way a government treats asylum seekers is very instructive because it shows you how they would treat the rest of us if they thought that they could get away with it. Only safe and legal routes would resolve these issues.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulations. Before I come on to the substantive points I wish to raise in relation to this bill, it is worth reminding ourselves that what we are debating in the chamber tonight touches upon the experiences of some of the most vulnerable people in global society. Faced against an ever-hardening legal system, asylum seekers find themselves in what can only be described as a paradox of precarity. The legal system offers asylum seekers little to no support, despite their already fragile and precarious position. This cannot be a satisfactory state of affairs. Madam Deputy Speaker, I contend that this bill only serves to entrench that paradox of precarity. Whilst an account of the traumas faced by those who have fled their homeland for fear of persecution are best left to those who have first-hand experience, we cannot underestimate the pain, suffering and disorientation faced by many of those who arrive on our shores. Let us reflect on the plight of the Uyghurs, the Rohingya and the Tigrayan people, for it is those groups that this bill will fall hardest upon, those fleeing war and genocide. For a nation whose proud reputation was founded on welcoming the persecuted over many centuries, this government is doing much to trash that. Compare Germany accepting 1 million from Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan in 2015, compared to the UK, promising to take just 20,000, mere 2%. Our reputation is the reason why our legal system ought to be a bastion of firm, steady protection for those most in need, not, as the case will be in the event of the passage of this bill, a contributory force in the erosion of the rights of asylum seekers. I'm afraid I want to let everyone speak this afternoon. Let me provide, Madam Deputy Speaker, 3 clear examples of how this bill will contribute to weaken protection for asylum seekers. Firstly, clauses 16 to 20, requiring asylum seekers to provide evidence supporting their claim by a specific date, appears to be almost entirely arbitrary. Indeed, the Immigration Law Practitioners Association has highlighted that the above clauses ignore the practical difficulties faced by many asylum seekers. Secondly, clause 24, allowing the Home Secretary to accelerate appeals where she thinks an appeal would be disposed of expeditiously, grates both against Article 34 of the UN Refugee Convention and the principles of natural justice, the very principles our legal system is founded upon. Signed into force by the Attlee government, it is more than regrettable that the UN Refugee Convention appears to now be held in such little regard by this government. Thirdly, Madam Deputy Speaker, not only will the Home Secretary have a much wider arsenal of powers at her disposal, the bill authorises decision makers to decide on the balance of probabilities rather than on reasonable likelihood whether a person claiming asylum has a well-founded fear of persecution. Let us be clear, this amounts to an unnecessary raising of the legal bar for asylum seekers to 16 cases. I struggle to see the valid policy reason for such a move in light of the Home Secretary's commitment to uphold their supposedly long, proud tradition for providing a home for people fleeing persecution and oppression. The answer, Madam Deputy Speaker, does not lie in raising the bar disproportionately high for asylum seekers to overcome, but a more holistic approach to the support offered. It is not just our footballers who can see this divisive government for what it is. The public is more compassionate than it is, and they seek a fair, compassionate system to provide for those in need. Thank you.
Great. What a great pleasure it is to see you in the chair, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, for many of my constituents, rightly or wrongly, the success of this particular bill is whether it stops or clearly limits three persistent and frustrating problems with our immigration and border controls. Number one, that it stops or clearly limits the use of the channel crossing by boat or truck to make a claim for asylum. Two, that it stops or clearly limits the filing over many years of speculative further asylum claims, frequently on specious grounds, that clog up our system and crowd out legitimate claims and generally make a mockery of our legal processes. And three, that it stops or clearly limits the opportunity for cherry picking that leads those people to make an asylum claim in the UK rather than the one or many other safe countries that they have traveled through. And for my right honourable friend and the Minister, it is those bases upon which my constituents would judge the success or failure of this measure, not the rhetoric that accompanies it. But for me, and I would say for some on this side of the House, there are other aspects that are important. And I would pick up the challenge from the SNP spokesperson about the views on this side, because there are aspects of nuance and detail that I think is important to bring out. First of all, that if the assessment system is to be quicker, then it's important the government ensures that claimants have much better access to legal advice. Secondly, to have a system that works effectively, there needs to be greater availability of counselling, of psychiatric and other medical assessments. Thirdly, that we should once and for all have a culture of getting to the truth rather than a culture of disbelief that has for too many years permeated the Home Office asylum system. Yes.
I'm very grateful to my old friend. And the reason I intervene is for this reason, because of course what's actually happening is the truth being obscured by repeated claims, which many of the people he describes are encouraged to lodge by unscrupulous lawyers that were given such a plaudit by the members of Stratton.
My right honourable friend speaks with very wise words, and if I may just address this to the honourable members opposite, there is no monopoly in compassion in just saying that it must apply to everyone in a particular process. Compassion applies to an individual claim. The importance of our system is we get to that individual and do not lose sight of him or her. And I have stood in a previous life as a member of parliament, on this side of the House, or on a previous immigration bill, and bemoaned the lack of compassion in our immigration system. And it was so encouraging to hear the Home Secretary use the word compassion so often in what she was saying, and on this side, to hear the stories of compassion, whether it's about how a council looks after the people who are claiming asylum or about people who feel about the system. So there is no monopoly of compassion here. And I look forward to working with the honourable gentleman opposite on finding ways that we can make that work more deeply in this bill. I will take an intervention if he wishes to come. Yes.
Honourable member, I have a lot of respect for him, particularly his stance in relation to immigration detention and the time limits that he has campaigned to put on that. The Home Secretary might talk about compassion though, but at the end of the day, this bill, as I've said a few times, and people don't seem to even acknowledge this fact, would criminalise people who the bill recognises are refugees, strip some of them of their family union rights, strip them of recourse to public funds, limit the amount of leave they're allowed here, and never let them even apply for settlement. That is not remotely compassionate, and we are talking about refugees.
Well, Lucy, I look forward to talking about some specifics there, because again, there's a bit more broad generalisation. But one thing I will say for the SNP is at least they have some ideas. I listened to the Shadow Home Secretary who said 10 minutes into his speech, let me tell you what the Labour Party will do. And he came up with one idea in the rest of his speech, with which he was going to make the set a legal target for how quickly asylum system claims get processed. Is that it? Is that all the Labour Party has to offer? I see that it is. So let's work with the SNP, and I will. And let me tell the honourable gentleman from the SNP where I think we can work together. Let's have some compassion on victims of slavery. There's plenty of support on this side for that. Let's have compassion in this bill about how we treat children. There's lots of support on all sides of this house for that. Let's have some compassion about how the particular issues of women will be affected by this separation of regular and irregular routes. And let's have some compassion, Minister, for once and for all ending indefinite detention.
And by video link to Grant Davies.
Madam Deputy Speaker, last week Swansea celebrated 10 years as a city of sanctuary. We offer a hand of friendship, not a fist of resistance. We are a community of communities moving forward together in an uncertain world. But this nationality and borders bill is not a helping hand for the fleeing from war and persecution, nor a worthy successor for Britain to the 1951 Refugee Convention we helped to produce. Instead, it is a mean-spirited act of national populism to provide more hostile environment for those in genuine need, having savagely cut overseas aid by 4.4 billion, which of course will increase the refugee demand. Last year, we had 27,000 asylum seekers in Britain, the 17th highest in Europe by head of the population, the 5th overall. So there isn't this sort of massive problem of refugees and asylum seekers. This debate has been whipped up as a cynical political exaggeration. And it is the case that there are millions of people who've been displaced from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, where we have been engaged in war. And we need to take our responsibility in due accord. The 1951 Refugee Convention recognises that fleeing from war and persecution, people do arrive irregularly. Obviously, they're escaping, but this bill reduces the rights of those people arriving irregularly by boat or by lorry, which is a natural way to escape. The plan is to put them into temporary isolated camps so they don't settle into a magnet for protesters and fascists and the like. They need rehabilitation and settling, not isolation and persecution. People who are travelling, not travelling directly or delaying, will get second-class treatment, Group 2 refugees, so-called. So they'll have to wait 30 months at a time. They'll have to wait 10 years before they've got any sort of permanency. And what's more, this bill criminalises people. They could face up to 4 years in prison if they don't arrive in a sort of regular way. Well, you wouldn't if you were escaping a war or persecution. And what we should be doing, like the United States at last, and Canada and Norway is increasing the number of refugees settled. Ours went down from 5,000 to 3,000. We should be nearer to 10,000. And the cut in overseas aid is going to hit the people in Yemen, Afghanistan and Syria the hardest and produce even more problems. And all we can do is create a hostile environment. We're better than this.
And by video, Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. Listening to this debate, not for the first time, there's been a real effort to talk down our record, to talk down the generosity of the British taxpayer. Take our Syrian refugee resettlement scheme. It's protected 25,000 people in the last 6 years, more than any other European country. That's worth restating. Conservative governments have done that. Conservative governments have resettled 25,000 people ahead of the rest of Europe. I want to take head on the shallow arguments being made against reform. We need to face a reality. Right now, estimates are that there are 426 million children living in conflict zones. There's absolutely no way that any country can provide a home and refuge to even a substantial proportion of these children. There are millions more people living in conditions all over the world that would qualify them for humanitarian relief. There are tens of millions of refugees. And importantly, there are many, many more people who live in similar circumstances to those already seeking to come here as economic migrants. Cannot help everyone. Labour want to pretend that there are no choices to make, and whatever choices we make, they'll find some way of saying the Labour Party are heroes and we are villains because they would have helped just a few more people. Same old Labour. There are millions of people that if they could get here would make a contribution, would become positive members of our society. A policy is not a failure because you can find an example of that. If Labour got their way entirely, still find refugees in camps that will be better off in the UK. It's a vacuous way to attack government policy in this issue. The question is, are we playing our part? And I want us to see getting the most out of the money we spend. For every person who gets here because criminal gangs took their money to get them across the channel, there is someone amongst the hundreds, thousands, millions of people who have not done that, that we could offer asylum to instead. And for every penny we spend on housing someone here, we could help many more people in conflict zones. Who is it we want to help? We always have to make a choice. Instead of helping the primarily fit young men of working age who make the channel crossing, we should help the children, the elderly, the destitute who can't. I welcome that we will make it absolutely clear coming here in a boat across the channel is not acceptable. There's only one way to do that, and that's to create a system that takes that into account. Sorting these issues out is actually what we need to do to secure long-term public support for taking in refugees. That isn't populism, that's democracy. The public are not stupid. They know there is a difference between economic migrants and refugees, and they know that boat crossings are a route that favours economic migrants. The public need confidence that the people we help are genuine refugees. I think it's important that we don't let our record turn into one we can't be proud of. We should keep our decent record, but by using the new system to rebalance the system to those that are the most vulnerable. This shift is a good one, and I'm someone who cares about vulnerable people, and I'm proud of our record, and I support these changes.
And by video to Florence Asylum.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair Speaker. Our asylum system has saved countless lives from persecution, discrimination and conflict. It plays a key role in enabling us to honour our international, legal and humanitarian responsibilities. And I'm proud that our country, my home, is a place that people in crisis come to for safety. There can be no doubt that our asylum system is in disarray. This bill was a chance to fix this. Instead, it will enable the government to turn its back on some of the most vulnerable people in this world. The number of people waiting more than 12 months for initial decision was over 33,000 last year. That's 10 times the number in 2010. This bill does nothing to address this shocking backlog, nor the discrimination and destitution faced by asylum seekers today. Instead, it will make their lives harder when they seek the safety they desperately need. This includes one of my constituents here in Vauxhall, an Eritrean national. Since he arrived in the UK over 18 months ago, he has been moved to 4 different hotels while waiting for an initial decision from the Home Office. During this time, he and a friend were subject to a shocking violent crime, an acid attack, that led to his friend losing his vision at just 18 years old. How much longer does my constituent have to wait to know whether he's finally free to start to rebuild his life here in the UK? Unfortunately, this bill doesn't answer his question. This bill creates no commitment to reopen safe routes or resettlement for family reunion. As many honourable and right honourable members have already highlighted, this is after the UK's new resettlement scheme resettled just 25 refugees in March. This bill proposes to build on the government's hostile environment agenda by criminalising some of the most vulnerable migrants, locking them up in an overseas accommodation centre. This is immoral and should shame us. Our asylum system should not be a soulless, bureaucratic administrative process or a tick box exercise. It's about people's lives, and it must therefore impassion compassion and understanding. This bill will make it harder for vulnerable refugees to build their lives And that is why I will be supporting the reasoned amendment put forward by the Leader of the Opposition.
And again by video link, Marco Longi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Immigration is one of the biggest issues of concern for my constituents in Dudley North, but I'd like to spend a few moments just talking about how we actually got to the point of where we are now. The Labour government of '97 changed everything. Blair's overhaul of Britain's immigration policies took average net entry into the country from 10 to 20,000 a year to 2 to 300,000 a year. From then onwards, the mere claim of asylum was sufficient to be allowed to stay in the country. This was when Labour and the media created a toxic atmosphere in which merely mentioning the word immigration branded a person as racist. And so any expression of fact about immigration was made impossible. From '97, Labour legally weaved into the very fabric of society something akin to a culture war against the British people and their mainstream values. The same people who value fairness, generosity, and compassion towards true asylum seekers who want a fair immigration system. These people have been bullied and abused by the toxic atmosphere created by Labour and by much of the media. Tragically, all politicians have since then failed them until now. And yes, true asylum seekers have equally been failed. Labour's legacy is clear if just by the numbers. Immigration estimates have consistently shown no resemblance to actual numbers. The recent resettlement applications have shown some 3 million additional applicants to the numbers forecast, almost 2/3 more than the forecast made by the same quangos who estimate housing need and advise government. This has been a failure of Labour policy and of civil service of gargantuan proportions, and my voters in Dudley have made that very clear to me. People smugglers have benefited by the UK magnet, and the system has helped migrants become prey to them and has put their lives in danger. Our councils haven't got enough houses, but we are asking them to develop Greenbelt. We don't have enough doctors, dentists or school places, but we need more interpreters for them. This colossal failure is what Labour designed and delivered when in power, thinking they would change society to keep them in power. In some places, this has worked. But the British people said enough in 2019, and they will hold every Labour MP in contempt for wanting to rejoin the EU and bring back freedom of movement. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is making solid progress. We want to be able to protect our poorest, weakest and most vulnerable. This bill will deliver on our people's priorities.
And by video link, Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Nationality and Borders Bill is anti-refugee to its core, and I will fight it every step of the way. It lacks basic humanity and represents an acceleration in the government's deeply damaging demonisation of migrants and asylum seekers. The bill will enable the UK government to block visas for overseas visitors if the Home Secretary believes that their country of origin is refusing to cooperate in taking back those they want to deport. Asylum seekers will be able to be removed from the UK while their asylum claim or appeal is pending, which opens the door to offshore asylum processing. Those who have fled war, famine, persecution or violence will be blocked at the border. This is based on the false premise that a refugee who has sought to escape persecution and danger through what the government calls an irregular route to the UK ought not to receive protection, creating a two-tier system regardless of need, criminalising those seeking protection whilst failing to end indefinite detention. This is cruel, deeply unjust and unworkable, and this from a government mostly comprised of individuals who have led lives of extraordinary privilege. The bill itself is illegal, breaching commitments under the Refugee Convention of 1951. Like many places in the UK, my home city of Leicester is forged from a proud history of welcoming refugees and asylum seekers. We are better for our diversity. The legislation shows that far from learning from the appalling treatment of the Windrush generation, the government is intent on expanding the damaging hostile environment. Asylum seekers arriving in Britain are often from countries where the UK has contributed to their disruption, either by arming current conflicts or through the enduring legacy of colonialism. The UK government has persistently been warned that if they do not open safe and legal routes for people to practice their legal right to claim asylum, then deaths at sea are unavoidable. Yet they have proceeded to close the few legal avenues that exist, such as the right to family reunion. Time and again, this government has chosen to turn its back on those seeking protection from war, climate disaster, torture, or other awful acts. This bill will compound the misery of people fleeing intolerable conditions. The government must end the destructive demonisation of refugees and asylum seekers and abandon this deeply damaging nationality and borders bill. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
And by video, Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking Liverpool Council, Health Projects and all community and voluntary organisations and Liverpool Riverside for the tireless and invaluable work they provide to the most vulnerable people who have fled unimaginable circumstances. And I'm really proud as a Scouser that Liverpool has a long history as a city of sanctuary and will continue to welcome refugees here, even though the Tories have stolen 63% of our central funding in the last 11 years. The bill is fundamentally flawed and will result in the government turning their backs on some of the most vulnerable people. And according to the UN Refugee Agency, the bill risks breaching international law. And rather than offering genuine proposals to fix the broken asylum system, the bill will make the situation even worse. And many asylum seekers are already desperately vulnerable when they reach the UK. The victims of war, persecution, humanitarian crisis, modern slavery, torture and sexual abuse. And their mental health deteriorates drastically through years of uncertainty and powerlessness. Separation of families torn apart with no family reunion rights for the years that they are stuck in the asylum system. And countless constituents have contacted my office, including one constituent waiting more than 3 years for a decision. Another, an engineering doctor who cannot work in his speciality, who submitted their citizenship claim in July last year after 15 years in the UK and still hasn't had a response. Or a Berti tribe member facing persecution in Sudan for his ethnicity, still not having had an interview after a year of application. My office has noticed the delays for asylum decisions getting longer and longer. The government's Nationality and Borders Bill not only fails to protect these and need of safety, but also treats them as criminals. All people seeking protection should be allowed to make an asylum claim, no matter how they've arrived. Creating a two-tier system that grants lesser rights to those who arrive in the UK outside of so-called official routes undermines the Refugee Convention. Madam Deputy Speaker, the bill does not address the government's failure since 2010 to competently process asylum applications. It contains no plan to reduce the backlog, and its provisions are instead likely to worsen wait times for applicants, leaving more people vulnerable, living in limbo, suffering uncertainty and anxiety. And instead of treating people fleeing war, persecution and trauma as criminals and forcing them into poverty and destitution with no prospect of escape for years, I implore to this government's humanity or what little they have to stop punishing people for seeking protection. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a genuine pleasure to rise and contribute to this debate with you in the chair, and I welcome you to. I hope you enjoy your time there. I want to speak in the limited time I have in support of those clauses in the bill which are designed to give more penalties for those who facilitate illegal immigration and more enforcement penalties too. And I speak from the perspective of representing ports in my constituency of Thurrock. It's not for nothing that the motto of Thurrock is known as "From Thames to all peoples of the world," and particularly the port of Tilbury has been very much at the heart of our island story of migration for many years. And from the perspective of the Windrush, and people used to arrive from around what was then the empire to come to this country, right through to today, where arrivals tend to be more of a clandestine nature. But there is one thing that unites all those people, and that is hope. You know, people want to come to this country because, let's be frank, it's the best country in the world. Why wouldn't people want to come here? And the fact of the matter is that there are organised criminal gangs who exploit that hope. And those people who get seduced into this fantasy that if they get here, the streets are paved with gold. All they need to do is get in and everything will be fine. They are victims of crime as much as the willful criminal activity to pervade our border is. So for me, it is all about going after those organised criminal groups that exploit people who only want to have a better life for themselves. And honourable members will remember in October 2019, I was standing in this very spot to talk about the fact that Essex Police had found a container with 39 poor souls who had died en route from Vietnam on arrival in this country. And I issued the challenge then that we had to go after these people, we had to bring them to justice, and that was the way of really tackling our illegal immigration system. Well, I can advise the House that Essex Police have been truly fantastic in prosecuting that investigations. There are already 10 convictions, and there are more coming down the track. And I have to really commend the energy with which officers throughout Essex Police have really sought to prosecute that investigation around the world. And it's, you know, let's not say this is not too difficult. We know these networks operate across many different jurisdictions, but with determination, we should go and get them. Because once we actually start to shut down these criminal gangs, they will move away from trafficking people into our country. Right now, they think that it's an opportunity-free crime. Let's make sure that instead of demonising those people who only have ambition to come here, we go after the serious criminals that are exploiting them to do so.
Neil Hanley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I make no apology for addressing this bill from through a Scottish prism, and with the absence of perhaps the member for North East Bedfordshire, the voices that I've heard speaking from the benches opposite have been really quite dispiriting. There's a toast from the Bard in Scotland that contains the phrase "was like us." And that toast will never be proposed to the British nationalism riven through the heart of this tawdry government. No more so in evidence than by the tenor, tone and impact of this inhumane anti-refugee bill. This government never seeks or seems to learn. Windrush, the PM's betrayal of his own Brexit promises to our EU friends, neighbours and family, a bill hostile to the world from a government hostile to Scotland, but with the temerity to claim they speak for us, that we are one nation. Well, if this bill achieves anything, it is to demonstrate how very different we are. What does it say to us in Scotland? We care not for your identity as a nation. You will fall in line. You will fail to meet the Refugee Convention. You will criminalise asylum seekers for exercising their legal right to seek asylum. You will process traumatised asylum seekers offshore. You will pile on pressure to the judicial system while reducing access to justice. You will re-traumatise victims. You will remove hope. You will decrease protection and enhance exploitation. You will do all of this, not because you want to, but because we say so. Your international welcome is not valued by this government. Your international friends are no friends of ours. Madam Deputy, or Mr. Deputy, or Mr. Speaker, my goodness, can't keep up. Nothing makes the case for independence stronger than such a murky piece of legislation. The people of Scotland will reject the UK government's divisive jingoistic nationalism and are revolted by the casual xenophobia it embodies. Successive UK governments have no qualms about hostility, invading nations, instigating conflict, supplying weapons to oppressive regimes the world over in the pursuit of wealth. And despite that profit, there's not a blush when they complain that those they help displace seek refuge on these shores. People in desperate need, victims, Mr. Speaker, recast as us and them. The response of providing needed help is not just a matter of basic humanity, it is a fundamental ethical concern. No us in humanity, no them in humanity, no humanity in this bill, and no humility in that government. Time for Scotland to face fact. We were dragged out of the EU against our will, and Scotland is being dragged through the gutter by the Tory party yet again. The people of Scotland was like us, and they certainly do not think that it is this shoddy Westminster government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Excellent. Perfect timing. So we're now going to put the question. The question is that the debate be now adjourned. As many of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have just got it. Debate to resume what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Right. I think we'll then put the following motions. If there's no objection, why? Yes.
Didn't and weren't called on the list today. I think there's people left. Can I just ask a question and for your direction and help, Mr. Speaker? Will those who weren't successful today be called tomorrow? Thank you.
Well, I don't think it's quite a point of order. I think what you want is some clarification for tomorrow. And Jim, I presume you must be looking for yourself and not others when you ask that question. What I would say is, I think those members who didn't get in today will be automatically put on the list. And those who don't want to be on the list, hopefully they'll withdraw. Right, I don't think there's any objections to putting the motions together. Motions 2 to 4 with leave of the House, Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is, that's on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House to now adjourn.
The question is this House to now adjourn. And we have Alicia Kearns online. Alicia, lovely to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nowhere in the country could offer a better home to the DEFRA than Melton Mowbray. Now, I could finish my speech there, but I suspect the Minister would like me to make my case in a little more detail. My debate this evening is a straightforward one. I am proud that our government is levelling up our country, but rural areas need levelling up too. And if the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs won't take up a rural home, then I ask the Minister, who will? To make my case, I'd like to start by inviting you to learn more about the wonderful town of Melton Mowbray. We are located in the very heart of the country. Our market town is